High floating meeting controls. Is that the one? Okay. Can you see the screen okay now?
Looks great.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to stop sharing now.
You can press escape to get those to show back up.
Got it.
Excellent.
Okay. So just one thing, I downloaded the Google Doc into a Word document just in case your internet is not good. So I'm reading it from a Word. I just thought about that. Just wanted to give you a heads up.
Sounds good. Yeah, I've got mine printed out too. So
got it.
I got new school and old school. Got it all covered.
Good. And Fadila, sorry, at the very beginning of the session, you will be introducing us, right? You will kick off the session, correct?
Yeah, so I'm just going to give, I was supposed to ask you about how much you would be introducing. I was just going to say, welcome, this is day 2, and just the name of the session, and the moderators are you and Seth. That's the extent I was going to go to. If you would like me to do more, that's also fine. And we are live on YouTube now. So,
excellent.
So if you wanted to, you can also put that on your social media.
Do that.
Thanks, Nick.
Attila, can you paste the YouTube?
Yep.
In the chat.
Is Nick a panelist? Yes.
Good morning, all.
Good morning.
Morning, Alejandro.
Good morning.
Thanks for joining.
Sounds like your laundry's done, Alejandro.
I know.
That's
Better
a good
breakfast.
They always put me a task to do during the week, during the time I'm here.
Life we live in now, right?
Yeah.
We have the same washing machine. We have the same tone, Alejandro.
Well, hopefully you don't have to do it too frequently.
With 2 babies, we do.
Oh, you do it more than me, yeah.
Yeah.
But yesterday went really smoothly, and I expect today to be the same. I think everybody did a great job yesterday. So I don't expect to see anything changing. And you guys are gonna have more control today. So it should be good. I have two computers, so I have to mute the other one too.
Yeah, congratulations yesterday. You went really, really well.
Hola. And hello, everyone, and welcome to day 2 of GCFI73. Thank you all for joining us today. We're going to have a really exciting special session today on recreational fisheries. So I would like to introduce our moderators from Environmental Defense Fund who will be leading today's presentations and setting the foundation on recreational fisheries management in the last 10 years, as well as the lessons learned, current efforts, and challenges. So our moderators today will be Eduardo Bonet and Sepp Hokibo. I'm sorry if I pronounced that wrong. So over to you, Eduardo and Sepp.
Thank you so much, Fadila. Welcome, everyone. Just a reminder to everyone that there's a translation function. There's a small globe button on the bottom right. So choose your native language for the channel. And from now on, I'm going to start speaking in Spanish. Muy buenos días. Gracias por conectarse. Un momento. Lo siento, tenía Gracias por conectarse al segundo día de la conferencia número 73 de GCFI. Como Fadila les mencionó, mi nombre es Lalo Bonet y soy gerente senior del programa de océanos de Cuba de Environmental Defense Fund, por sus siglas EDF. Mi colega Sepp, Fadila Ali y Alejandro Acosta de GCFI, tenemos el gusto de darles la bienvenida a la sesión especial Gestión pesquera de las pesquerías recreacionales en el Golfo de México y el Caribe. Descubrimientos recientes, desafíos actuales y oportunidades futuras. Quiero hablar brevemente sobre EDF y los objetivos de esta sesión. EDF es una organización global no gubernamental dedicada a preservar los sistemas naturales de los que depende toda la vida. Guiados por la ciencia y la economía, encontramos soluciones prácticas y duraderas a los problemas ambientales más graves. Parte de nuestro trabajo se enfoca en la conservación de los océanos, específicamente a través del manejo sostenible de pesquerías. El sector de la pesca recreativa forma parte esencial de este trabajo y, de esta forma, los objetivos que perseguimos con esta sesión son los siguientes. Compartir lecciones aprendidas recientes sobre la gestión de la pesca recreativa, incluyendo prácticas eficaces de manejo, colecta de datos e incorporación de voces del sector recreativo en el proceso participativo. Comprender las necesidades y desafíos actuales de los administradores pesqueros y diversos actores en países específicos de la región. Y finalmente, esbozar oportunidades para que la red GCFI y la comunidad en general comiencen a abordar las mayores necesidades y desafíos. Cedo ahora la palabra a mi colega Sepp.
Thanks, Lalo, and welcome everybody. My name is Sepp Hokibo, and I am the manager of EDF's Recreational Fisheries Solutions Program. I am based in Galveston, Texas, on the western side of the Gulf of Mexico. We've got calm seas and sunny skies today, and I'm excited to be here. Now I'd like to give an overview of the events of this special session. We have 3 days, including today's panel 1, which will have presentations. We'll have a live panel tomorrow with Q&A. And finally, a workshop on Friday where invited participants will meet in breakout groups to discuss next steps to help maintain momentum from this meeting. And after that closed door session, we will have an open plenary where we will share the discussions and talking points from each of those breakouts. We will be creating a report from the proceedings of this special session, and that should be made available in December. We will also have all the recordings from today, which will be made available on GCFI's YouTube channel. Now I'm going to share my screen real quick and go over a little bit of housekeeping before I introduce the keynote. All right. Hopefully everybody can see that. Well, real quick, let's dive into the definition of recreational fishing that we are using for this special session. Recreational fishing is an incredibly hard focus area to define. If you look across countries around the world, there's a lot of different definitions, a lot of different examples around the world. But for this session, we are going to use the FAO definition, which includes the fishing of aquatic animals, mainly fish, that do not constitute the individual's primary resource to meet basic nutritional needs, and which are not generally sold or otherwise traded on export, domestic, or black markets. For folks that have never seen the FAO definition or any of the other FAO recreational fishing resources, this is a great link at the bottom, or you can just Google FAO and recreational fishing. Let's see. There we go. Reminders to the audience, we want this to be as interactive as possible, so please type any questions or comments you might have in the chat box. Some of you guys might know there's an applause button on Zoom. There's a thumbs up button. We're going to use a lot of the material that's in the chat box today for the follow-up questions in the Q&A tomorrow. So I also want to make sure nobody's sleeping out there. So even if folks just give a thumbs up here and there, it'll be great to get that interaction. Remember to use the translating tool. If we're getting anybody that's joining late, there is a small little globe emblem at the bottom right where you can choose your native language and choose that channel. If you choose English, it will stay English the whole time, even as Lalo and I switch back and forth to different languages. Also, just a reminder for everyone to keep their microphone muted throughout the conference so that we can make sure things operate smoothly. And lastly, well, real quick, before I give this, before I give the introduction to our thematic keynote, I wanted to real quick get a survey where everybody is joining in from. So if you can type your location and the organization where you are based into the chat box, it'd be great to see where everybody's coming. Nice. Bermuda, Louisiana, Puerto Rico. I see Benjamin from the Bahamas. Guam, wonderful. Colombia. CFAS, UK, Panama. Man, they're flying in too fast to even read. We got Merida, Panama, South Africa. All right. I think I saw Colorado State. Wow. All right. Florida, Texas. Hey, Will, good to see you on here. Police Fisheries Department, wonderful. Guatemala. All right, well, great to have everybody here. This is exciting to see a really broad regional representation, as well as, I'm sure, a really broad representation from guides, from managers, from scientists, from NGOs. So I will real quick introduce Professor Warren Potts, who is our keynote today. All right, Professor Warren Potts was going to provide a keynote on effective governance in recreational fisheries, recommendations from research and experience. Professor Potts is a researcher in the Department of Ichthyology and Fisheries Science at Rhodes University in South Africa. After working as a fishing guide in Angola for several years, Warren Potts became extremely interested in all the aspects of recreational fisheries, and particularly how they can benefit developing country economies with different biological impacts other than traditional fisheries. He was the primary author on the 2019 paper, What Constitutes Effective Governance of Recreational Fisheries, which was a global review. And that was actually the initial inspiration for this special session at this year's GCFI conference. So I will stop sharing. I will turn it over to Lalo, and he is going to share the keynote. Thanks again, everybody, for joining.
Thank you, Sep. Give me 1 second so I can share my screen with you all. And here we go.
Potts, I am the keynote speaker for this session. I'm from the Department of Ichthyology and Fishery Science at Rhodes University, South Africa, and I'd like to welcome you all to this session. Before I start, I'd just like to thank the GCFI for organizing this conference, and also to Sep from the EDF for helping me with the preparation of this keynote talk. So without further ado, I'd like to start my presentation. And its title is Effective Governance of Recreational Fisheries, Recommendations from Research and Experience. Just first to give you a little bit of my context, I've been a fisherman for as long as I can remember. I spent a great deal of my time fishing. I was an angling guide for 2 years in Angola. I'm also a competitive angler. I've worked extensively with fisheries managers and with the fishing tackle industry over the years. And I'm currently the head of the Southern African Fisheries Ecology Research Lab, which is based at Rhodes University. And over time, I think that I've developed a holistic understanding of complexity of recreational fisheries, and I sort of understand it from the perspective of most stakeholders. So the structure of this presentation is fairly simple. I'll start with an introduction on recreational fishes. I'd look at a global review of their governance, talk about economics and leakage, look at recreational fisheries compliance, the impact of guides on angler behavior, and then the potential of angler self-reform. And then finally, where we need to go forward from the perspective of recreational fisheries. So to begin with, recreational fisheries are extremely popular worldwide. Recreational fishing is extremely popular worldwide. It's got a participation rate that is enormous, particularly in the developed world, where it reaches up to 30% of all the population. We don't know too much about the developing world, but what we do know is it's not yet as popular, but there are many areas in the developing world that its recreational fishing has not been assessed. In terms of the catch of recreational fisheries, there's a recent study by Freer, which shows that the marine recreational catches is massive in recreational fisheries. And it's increased from the 1950s up to the now 2010s and 20s to around 900,000 tons per year. If you have a look at their global marine trends and catches, you will see that areas like Asia, Africa, and South America have been increasing rapidly in terms of their catch, whereas Europe and North America and Oceania has remained fairly stable recently, suggesting that the developing world recreational fisheries are developing quite quickly. Importantly, the recreational fisheries in the marine environment predominantly take place in the coastal zone, which means that these fisheries are potentially highly destructive in these environments and often outcompete almost all other fisheries in these areas. Another important component of recreational fisheries is that approximately 60% of all fish captured in these fisheries are released. So while the total catch is estimated at 900,000 tons, there's additional fish that are caught and then released. And the survival of these fishes is not necessarily guaranteed, but it's highly context dependent. So in some fisheries, with some environments, such as deep sea fisheries, deep water fisheries, survival tends to be quite low, whereas in other fisheries, survival can be quite high. Recreational fisheries are generally very difficult to manage when compared to commercial fisheries. And that is mainly because they are open access, which means that there's very little effort control. So we have to use other mechanisms to control them. Recreational fishers employ a diversity of gears, cast nets, hook and line, obviously, and spears. And in addition to that, some countries, even gill nets are used. It's quite different to commercial fisheries where generally only one gear is used per fishery. And recreational fisheries, the effort is generally very broadly dispersed. And this makes monitoring and compliance efforts very, very difficult, because you can't just necessarily go to a single port as you would with a commercial fishery, but you'd have to try and find anglers over a widely dispersed area. Recreational fishers are also highly mobile and tend to go to where the fish are biting. And so if you monitor recreational catches, you will find that you only are getting an impression of the catch in areas where the fish are and where the fish stocks are relatively healthy. So you tend to miss the areas and don't get a full understanding of areas where fish stocks are collapsing. And Post defined this sort of as the invisible collapse in recreational fisheries. Recreational anglers also, unlike commercial anglers, have a wide range of motivations for fishing. Commercial fisheries, the fishers only essentially fish for profit. But in the case of recreational anglers, people go out for a variety of things. They might go out to catch a trophy fish, or they might go out for a good day outdoors. And therefore, it makes it quite difficult to understand the fishers, the recreational fishers themselves, and in turn makes it difficult to manage them. Recreational fishers are also self-subsidizing. Commercial fishers, for example, will stop fishing when the stock reaches a certain level, because it's no longer economically profitable for them to carry on fishing. But recreational anglers who self-subsidize their activities continue going fishing, even when stocks are very low, which means they can potentially deplete fish stocks far lower than what commercial fisheries do. And then there are also rapid technological developments. And while this happens in all sectors, it's often more controlled in commercial fisheries. And in recreational fisheries, the rapid technological developments can have really big impacts on catch rates, for example. So an example of that would be the advent of braided lines, which have made recreational fishing much more effective. The other would be the development of drones, which have allowed people, shore-based anglers, to take their baits far offshore. And it's also allowed boat-based anglers to quickly spot bait fish or shoals of fish that they wish to target. So recreational fisheries are really highly complex socio-ecological systems. They have a societal system, which is complex, a governance system, which is difficult, and then they have the ecosystem. And the ecosystem is often shared with other fisheries, such as commercial and small-scale fisheries. And this is an example of the South African line fishery, hook and line fishery, which has a commercial component, and it has small-scale components, both from the shore and from boats. And the recreational fisheries compete directly with those particular sectors for resources. And you'll find that in the developing world, this is really the case. You find that your recreational sectors tend to compete directly with small-scale livelihood sectors. And if these recreational sectors are poorly managed, it can have devastating consequences for fishers. So how are we doing in terms of recreational fisheries governance around the world? Well, we did a paper, which I know that you may have glanced at by now, on the governance structures for recreational fishers. And in that, we basically reviewed fisheries policy of all countries. We looked for the mention of recreational fishing or any similar term in policy. We looked for a definition of recreational fishery, and then whether there was, in fact, a recreational fisheries policy. And then we evaluated all of these policies to gauge how effective they were in terms of, and also whether they were sort of state-of-the-art type of fisheries management policies. We also developed a questionnaire to gauge the efficacy of recreational fisheries governance in the different countries, and then we sent that out to different stakeholders and experts in over 100 different countries. And we found, by and large, that recreational fisheries was defined in many countries. Some countries, there was no definition of recreational fishes. It was often included and directly referred to in policies or acts, but in some countries not really, and some not at all. And we found that in general, the policies were not very well developed in terms of contemporary fisheries governance policies. And there were clear gaps in gender and social equity, climate change, There was not much room for adaptive management in the recreational fisheries in terms of policy. And we found that policies covering recreational fishing hadn't been updated very regularly in the majority of countries. We also found that often recreational fishing methods weren't well specified in policies. And as a whole, there was a bit of a difference between the developed and developing world, in that the policies for the developing world were on the whole poorer than they were for developed nations. We then looked at the implementation of these policies, and again, there was a clear difference in that the developing world tended to be far poorer in terms of its implementation and effective management of recreational fisheries, and also compliance in recreational fisheries was considered particularly poor in developing nations. But generally, only very few countries felt that their recreational fisheries management was effective. Compliance was also considered to be very poor in all but 2 countries. And overall, recreational fisheries were thought to be managed far worse than the industrial sector and even the small scale sector by all of these stakeholders that filled in the questionnaire. Importantly, I think one of the caveats to the study were that there were only really between 1 and 5 stakeholders that answered the questionnaire in each of these countries. So they might be fairly skewed by individual country, but when looking at holistically, I think we gave a fairly good representation of what is out there globally. In terms of the Caribbean, the scoring was fairly low. The Bahamas came out very, very well. In fact, it was by far and away the best developing country nation, both in terms of its policy score and in terms of the fisheries policy implementation. But when you look at the mean scores for Caribbean nations that we looked at, you'd find that those scores were pretty low, with the total recreational sector score, which was a combination of the policy and implementation score of only 27%, which means that there's a great deal of work to be done in terms of policy and implementation and governance of recreational fisheries in the Caribbean. So briefly, the recommendations that we can probably make for these areas, certainly to the managers, is that there's a clear need to motivate for policy or improvements to the policy, obviously with the exception of the Bahamas, and managers should consider doing that. They should work with policymakers to ensure that their needs are served. Importantly, they should set up collaborative networks with all recreational fisheries stakeholders. Also figure out what the best cost recovery strategy might be for them, because ultimately this is going to provide them the money that they need to manage the fishery and implement the policy. And in terms of compliance, which clearly is an issue globally, they would need to consider a broad range of interventions. And I'm going to speak a bit about that a little bit later, to try and improve compliance in their region. In terms of scientists, I think in terms of governance, I think the best thing for them to do is to work with managers to try and provide them the necessary information. And when we're talking about support for better governance, we're talking about socioeconomic research and trying to elevate the importance of the recognition of the importance of recreational fisheries. And in terms of guides and anglers, I can recommend that guides and anglers should try and get organized so that they can have a unified voice, some voice that can be easily engage with managers and scientists. It's very difficult for managers and scientists to engage with a sort of a broadly dispersed group of individuals, but when you are organized and you come with a common voice, it becomes much easier for engagement. And the countries with the best recreational fisheries governance always tend to have strong angler lobby groups, and I'm talking about the US and Australia in particular. They've got very strong lobby groups that fight for the rights of recreational fishers. So one of the components that we sort of observed in the governance was the need to recognize the economic impact of recreational fisheries, so that you could essentially convince your government that recreational fisheries were important and would get you a seat at the fisheries management table. And I was very pleased to find that economic impact assessments for recreational fishing have been done in, for example, Martinique, the Bahamas, and then also billfish in general for the Caribbean. But while that is an essential first step, it's important to realize that economic impact isn't always a good indicator of local benefit and how important recreational fishing is for locals. So in theory, a foreign tourist recreational angler would arrive to a country, and even before he arrives, he's paid an all-inclusive package to a lodge or an outfitter or an operator, and then he goes off fishing. He also pays for flights, and this the flights may be local airlines, or they might be foreign airlines or airlines where he lives, and then local charters. And all of that has a big implication. The way that it's done has big implications for how locals benefit. So once he pays the operator or lodge, the money that he pays would then get included into local costs. So get the outfitter, then the operator pays for local costs like fuel, airport transfer, food costs, maintenance costs for the vehicles and the boats, and that all moves straight into the local economy. The operator could then also pay for local staff costs, such as guides or chefs, for example, but these could also quite easily be foreign staff. So the guides could be foreign, the chefs could be foreign. And this means that the money is essentially lost to the local economy. If the operator is local, then a proportion of the profit will stay with them and therefore stay in the country, and it's obviously injected into the economy. But if the operator is foreign, most, if not all, of the profit essentially ends up leaving the country. And then in terms of the flights, if it's, as I said, international flights, international airlines, then only airport taxes really accrue to the national fiscus. And in contrast, if it's a local airline, then some money would accrue, and charter airlines, some additional money would accrue into the local economy. But essentially, the take-home message is that a lot of foreign money leaks out, and locals don't always benefit. We decided to look at this, and we did a case study in Angola, looking at the local benefits from recreational fisheries. So to just give you an impression of the kinds of things that we tried to estimate, the first was total revenue, which was defined as the money spent by fishing tourists when they visited the lodge for the purposes of recreational fishing. We then looked at local total revenue, which is the money that was spent by the lodge or by any of that money that came in, spent within the locality, which is about 15, with about 50 impression. The lodge is over here near the mouth of the estuary, and the 15 kilometers would cover the local community village, the fuel pump, and the areas for boat hire. And that's essentially all that there was. And then of that local money that came in to either the lodge or anywhere else, a lot of that is actually leaked and not actually given to a local person, either through payment or profit. And once you subtract that is not given to people through payment or profit, you end up with your retained local revenue. So the results of this were quite interesting, and we compared the foreign lodge recreational fishery for one season, threadfin season, with the local recreational fishery, so people that don't stay at a lodge. And interesting, they brought in roughly the same amount of total revenue, around 125 or around 120,000 US dollars. Then of that money, how much of it actually came into the local area, that 15 kilometer radius? Well, about 70% of it came in both fisheries. And the difference, though, however, was that only 8% of the revenue from the foreign lodge recreational fishery was actually retained in that local fishery. The majority of it went out to foreign guides, the foreign owner, and the foreign lodge managers. And consequently, of all the money that came in, only 8% was retained in the local economy. In contrast, for the local recreational fishery, because these fishers hired boats, hired local guides, a lot of the money, a lot of the money that was actually retained in the local community. So there's a massive difference in the amount of leakage between the foreign recreational fishery and the local recreational fishery. But critically, the foreign lodge recreational fishery brings in money from outside the country, which means it's new money. It's not just money circulated within the national economy, which is what the local recreational fishery was doing. So to conclude about the economic component, the leakage component is very context specific. We need local research to quantify it and also identify potential barriers to local economic benefit. So there's some really good examples where economic leakage is actually probably fairly reduced in the Caribbean. And an example of that was the Andros Island, where up to 80% of the local inhabitants are actually employed in bonefish lodges. And that just suggests to me that the leakage, there might be really reduced leakage in these kind of environments. The other recommendation out of this is that we should definitely develop mechanisms to reduce leakage, and they should be incorporated into policy. There's a clear indication that recreational fishers themselves, foreign recreational fishers, are willing to pay to ensure that the money that they bring in actually benefits local communities. And this was done in a recent survey, a recent study in the Caribbean. So there are real opportunities to benefit local communities. But instead of just paying local people, I think that we really need a more holistic approach. We need to identify what the lodges need. Do they need guides? Do they need food? Do they need local produce? What do they need? And then we need to establish partnerships between government sectors to try and upskill local communities to make sure that they can actually provide things that the lodges need. So recreational fisheries compliance is a problem throughout the world, and we recognize that in our governance study, but it's been going on for decades. And it really has the potential to undermine not only the management of recreational fisheries, but also those of other coastal fisheries sectors. And there are a load of things that influence levels of compliance, and it's generally context specific. But the factors that influencing them are the knowledge and awareness of anglers, of regulations, for example, of stock status, the perceived legitimacy of the management agency, and that was massively important in determining South Africa's compliance in South African recreational fisheries, and social norms. So in other words, what other people do in the recreational fishery largely determines how an angler behaves. And then economic conditions. Poorer people are less likely to be compliant with conditions. And that's certainly what we found in our South African case study. Ultimately, managers need to evaluate the level of compliance and the drivers of non-compliance in their fishery if they want to design ways to improve recreational fisheries compliance. And there are a number of ways to estimate compliance. We've done some work on ways to estimate compliance, and surveys are generally the best method, but you need to make sure that anglers answer truthfully. So there's a whole lot of social techniques that we evaluated to find out how to do these surveys so that they provide you with robust results, and this as an example. So in terms of improving compliance, there's a couple of trains of thought that in terms of sociology. The first is the instrumental concept, and that's that anglers are rational and they pursue their own interests according to their own costs or benefits. And the second is that an individual's decision to comply is really dictated by morality, legitimacy, and social and cultural norms. In recreational fisheries, we've predominantly dealt with the instrumental concept, and it's thought to be primarily determined as a trade-off between the financial incentive to comply and the chance of detection. So therefore, all compliance strategies are generally centered around enforcement and penalties. And the problem is that although enforcement has proved to improve compliance, increased enforcement, we found that by and large, because recreational fishes are so difficult to enforce because they're so widespread, you often don't have the funding to have adequate enforcement for your recreational fisheries. So the alternative is to increase penalties, but that doesn't often work because people, if penalties become ridiculously high, people will just rebel against them and you will find very, very little compliance. So the normative concept, unfortunately, hasn't really been extensively used when dealing with recreational fisheries. And that's probably because of the real broad range of demographic characteristics, motives, attitudes, and social values that recreational fishers have. And that makes it very difficult to design a good normative approach. But more recently, there's a couple of studies that have looked at alternative and potential normative approaches. And the first of those was one from our lab looking at the potential for a social norms approach for improving recreational fisheries compliance. And the second was a study from Australia, which looked at the idea of using nudges, social nudges, to try and improve recreational fisheries compliance. And I would suggest that people have a look at these papers and have a look at some of the normative concepts that are around it. But regardless, if you want to improve compliance, you need to be holistic. You need to improve knowledge and awareness. You need to incorporate traditional monitoring and compliance activities, and you need to try and include some of the normative approaches, such as nudges and social norms. Now, fishing guides are incredibly important actors in recreational fisheries, and I see that particularly in the Caribbean, they play a major role in recreational fisheries, and they can also be a major social influence. So we have a PhD study in the SAFER lab at the moment working on recreational angling guides, and we were particularly looking to see how they influenced angler environmental behavior, and we focused on catch and release. But first we wanted to try and see if recreational angling guides were actually perceived as role models by recreational angling clients. So you can tell if someone is a role model if they are a behavioral model, if they represent what is possible, and if they are inspirational. And this is theory that we got from the social scientists in a study by Morgenroth. And so we designed a questionnaire to try and assess if angling guides were role models. And we sent these out, and we sent it out to anglers that had been on guided trips, and we got 492 complete responses from 29 countries. And these guys had fished in 99 country destinations, predominantly the USA and South Africa. And we found that when we gave a series of statements which aligned with our theory, we found that by and large, anglers either agreed or strongly agreed with our statements. And they were statements such as, my angling guides have shown me new tactics and techniques which could make me a better angler. I admire my angling guide. My angling guide motivated me to try and improve myself as an angler. And these all sort of fed into the theory that we were testing about role models. And essentially what this did was it provided us with overwhelming support suggesting that recreational angling guides are in fact role models for anglers. And that essentially means that guides are potentially highly influential in terms of environmental and catch and release best practice. So we wanted to test what the actual knowledge of angling guides was in terms of these things. So we sent out a survey asking guides about their environmental responsibility, their catch and release best practice knowledge, and overall their environmental behavior. And we got responses from 346 guides from 47 different countries around the world, and they guided in 79 different destination countries. We found that overwhelmingly they agreed that guides were responsible for the custodians. They were custodians of their fisheries resources. They felt that they were role models. They strongly agreed with that. And they felt even that they should sacrifice the success of their clients for sustainable fishing practices. So there was a clear recognition that they were very important in both looking after resources and also influencing angler environmental behavior. When we looked at their knowledge and we compared their knowledge based on what we we knew to be best practices based on the most contemporary literature, we found that the guides generally tended to have very good knowledge about handling practices in fishes and landing practices, and also recovery practices in fishes. But they tended to have less, their knowledge was not as good in terms of unhooking their fish and their actual releasing of fish. The knowledge tended to be poorer. And this is really going to help us try and narrow down how we can help with education programs to better inform guides about best practices. We also looked at environmental behavior, and anglers, guides were very, very pro-environmental as a whole. They were very vehemently opposed to things like leaving litter at the water's edge, but they were not always that opposed to things that they maybe didn't perceive to be environmentally threatening, such as holding a fish above a hard rocky substance or sand or a foreign substance while anglers were taking photos of them, because obviously if they squirm and drop, they can injure themselves quite significantly. So there was a bit of potential room for improvement in some of their environmental knowledge. So to move away from anglers now, from guides now, and talk a little bit about anglers, I want to talk about anglers and self-reform. And the first sort of seeds of me thinking about self-reform came from a paper in 2013 by Steve Cook and others, including Andy Donalchuk, who works quite a bit in the Bahamas, I understand. And they were talking about voluntary institutions and behaviors as alternatives to formal regulations in recreational fisheries. And so I quickly thought I'd mention a study that we've done recently. And this is by an honor student in our lab who looked at a Facebook group. So an informal institution, a social media group in South Africa. It's called Salt Fishing South Africa. It has about 62,500 members, about 10% of all marine recreational anglers in South Africa. And it's administered by conservation conscious anglers, not by scientists, not by managers, but by anglers themselves. And so we wanted to have a look to see if there was any evidence of improved behavior over time. So we had a look at the proportion of pro-environmental comments in response to posts over time, the proportion of photo posts of fish that were killed and of fish that were released over time. And then we looked at, based on the photos that we saw, we looked at we developed some metrics to see whether these were handled well based on what we could see in the photographs or not. And we found that there was a very, very clear shift and a very clear increase in the amount of pro-environmental comments from 2013 up to 2020, which is a very positive finding. We also found that the number of catch and kill in the red here photographs decreased markedly from the early days to the 2020s. And in contrast, the amount of catch and release photos really increased a lot. And in terms of the actual photos themselves, when fish were released, we found that the proportion of good practices in catch and release actually increased markedly from 2013 up to 2020. And this suggests that anglers do not necessarily need regulations or managers to make them improve their behavior. Anglers can do it themselves. So to summarize, I'd like to give a couple of take-home messages from the work that I've just discussed. For the managers, I think importantly, most importantly is to develop cooperative relationships with scientists, guide, and anglers. And then together try and identify governance gaps and to engage with upper level, and then use those to engage with upper level decision makers. Scientists should ideally provide robust evidence support managers, and as they seek improved recognition for recreational fisheries, they should also attempt to provide robust evidence that allows managers to make better informed decisions about regulations. And then also provide information to anglers about the status of their resources and their best angling practices. In terms of the guides, I think it's critical that guides recognize that how they behave and what they tell anglers really matters. They should ideally familiarize themselves with the status, the biology, and the movement of the fish stocks that they are fishing for, so that they can educate anglers, and then consult with scientists to learn best practice for catch and release in their fisheries. There are a number of very, very good scientists working on the Caribbean and on catch and release practices. Jake Branscombe springs to mind immediately, and he'd be a really good guy to speak to for the guides. In terms of anglers, I could suggest that you organize yourselves to facilitate engagement with managers and scientists, and I think you use groups to exert social pressure on poor behavior, such as non-compliance and those kinds of things. And then for everyone, I think we must recognize that recreational fisheries is really a collective effort, and everyone has a specific role to play. And to begin with, start by communicating and finding ways to work together. And I'm really hoping that this particular conference will provide a platform for everyone to do this. And I thank you so much for this opportunity. I'd like to thank also my collaborators and students who helped me with a lot of the research that I presented. I'd like to thank my funders. I'd like to thank the GCFI and the EDF for their assistance in pulling this together, and to all of those who listened. And please feel free to contact me if you'd like to chat further. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Warren Potts, for this incredible conference. Y bueno, agradecemos al Dr. Warren Potts por dar inicio a esta sesión sobre pesca recreativa con esta excelente conferencia magistral. Les recordamos a todos escribir las preguntas que tengan tanto para el Dr. Potts como para el resto de los panelistas usando la función del chat. El día de hoy, por cuestiones de tiempo, no podremos contestar estas preguntas, pero las contestaremos mañana durante el segundo día de esta sesión, donde los panelistas podrán contestar a sus preguntas. Entonces, por favor, utilicen la función del chat. A continuación, escucharemos 3 presentaciones ligadas al sector de la pesca recreativa en Cuba y daremos comienzo con la presentación El sector pesquero recreativo en Cuba bajo la luz de la nueva ley de pesca, a cargo de Araceli Yegi Hernández. Ella es investigadora del Centro de Investigación Pesquera de Cuba, el CIP. Yegi estudió biología marina en el Centro de Investigación Marina de la Universidad de La Habana. Actualmente está a cargo de la gestión de datos sobre la pesca de pepino de mar, tiburones y rayas. Es investigadora principal en proyectos oficiales de tiburones y rayas en la isla, organizando proyectos de investigación científica, capacitaciones sobre talleres de identificación y conservación de tiburones y rayas para pescadores y personal portuario. Yegi lleva a cabo la evaluación anual de las poblaciones de pepino de mar y recomienda límites de captura para cada una de las 4 zonas de pesca de Cuba. Denme un segundo para proyectar la presentación de Yegi. Y aquí vamos.
Buenos días. A continuación se presentará el tema El sector pesquero recreativo en Cuba bajo la luz de la nueva ley de pesca. Como bien planteó la FAO en 2008, la pesca deportiva recreativa constituye una fuente de entretenimiento, empleo, comida y un bienestar social y económico para las personas en todo el mundo, tanto para las generaciones actuales como para las futuras. En Cuba, esta actividad goza de una gran importancia. Debido a su condición de isla, posee numerosos asentamientos y pueblos costeros donde sus habitantes tienen una tradición de años en la pesca recreativa. Se han reportado que se vinculan a la pesca recreativa y deportiva 17.600 trabajadores y 5.436 embarcaciones. En el siglo pasado, la pesca estaba regulada por 3 documentos: la Ley General de Pesca de 1936, el Reglamento de la Ley de 1956 y el Reglamento para la Pesca No Comercial de 1982. Estos documentos se unificaron en un solo cuerpo legal denominado Reglamento de Pesca en 1996, cuyo órgano rector era el Ministerio de la Industria Pesquera. Este ministerio se fusionó con el Ministerio de la Industria Alimenticia y se creó el actual Ministerio de la Industria Alimentaria, MINAL, el cual presenta un Departamento de Regulaciones Pesqueras y Ciencias. El pasado año 2019 se aprueba por la Asamblea Nacional del Poder Popular de la República de Cuba la nueva Ley de Pesca, el reglamento de la Ley de Pesca y las resoluciones ministeriales. Esta ley ahora presenta como órgano rector el actual Ministerio de la Industria Alimentaria. El objeto de la nueva Ley de Pesca es establecer las regulaciones para el adecuado ordenamiento, administración y control de la pesca, en función de la conservación y el aprovechamiento racional de los recursos hidrobiológicos en las aguas marítimas, fluviales y lacustres de la República de Cuba, con el fin de contribuir a la soberanía alimentaria de la nación. Los principios que rigen la ordenación de los recursos pesqueros en la nueva Ley de Pesca son la conservación y uso sostenible, el enfoque precautorio, la implementación de criterios científicos tecnológicos y la protección de los ecosistemas marinos fluviales y lacustres. En este nuevo cuerpo legal se definen las nuevas modalidades de pesca, las cuales comprenden la pesca comercial, la pesca deportiva, la pesca recreativa y la pesca de investigación. En este documento la pesca deportiva queda separada de la pesca recreativa y es de estas modalidades de las que vamos a estar hablando en esta presentación. La pesca deportiva queda definida como aquella que consiste en la captura de organismos acuáticos con fines competitivos sin que medie ánimo de lucro. Esta modalidad solo se efectúa mediante eventos deportivos oficiales. Estos eventos se organizan a través del Instituto Nacional de Deportes, Educación Física y Recreación, INDER, y el Ministerio de Turismo, MINTUR, los cuales se coordinan con el Ministerio de la Industria Alimentaria como organismo rector de la actividad pesquera. La pesca recreativa queda definida como aquella mediante la que se produce la captura de organismos acuáticos con fines recreativos o de esparcimiento, sin que medie ánimo de lucro. En esta se incluye la pesca submarina. Se puede realizar desde el litoral y desde la orilla de las aguas marítimas, fluviales y lacustres por medio de buques, embarcaciones, artefactos navales o mediante la pesca submarina. Los artes de pesca y los avíos permitidos para efectuar la pesca recreativa son el carrete, la vara, el cóctel y el anzuelo. Se autoriza el uso de la atarraya exclusivamente en aguas marítimas y con el único fin de obtener carnada. En la pesca submarina solo se puede usar escopetas de liga o resorte, oleoneumáticas y arpón, siempre en cantidades unitarias. En la pesca recreativa y la pesca deportiva queda prohibido el uso de artes masivos como son las nazas, palangres, redes de enmalle, tranques, chinchorros. Tampoco se puede usar sustancias químicas ni explosivos. La pesca submarina es la única modalidad de pesca recreativa en la que se regulan los días de pesca, ya que solo puede efectuarse los sábados, domingos y días feriados en las aguas marítimas de preferencia para la pesca recreativa y mediante buceo a pulmón libre. Se prohíbe también la celebración de cualquier tipo de evento competitivo relacionado con la pesca submarina en el territorio nacional. Las autorizaciones para la pesca recreativa están reguladas por la emisión de licencias, las cuales comprenden la licencia para la captura de embarcaciones en aguas marítimas o embalses, la captura en embalses de interés estatal desde la orilla, la captura mediante la pesca submarina. También se emiten licencias para la pesca recreativa que practica el turismo en las áreas protegidas, en cuyo plan de manejo se permite la práctica de la pesca con las técnicas trolling o al fly, donde se aplica la variante de captura y suelta. Dentro de las zonas de pesca, la práctica de la pesca puede estar limitada o totalmente prohibida en algunos sitios, debido a intereses estatales relacionados con la defensa del país o el medio ambiente, las que se establecen por el Ministerio de la Industria Alimentaria, a partir de la compatibilización con los ministerios de las Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias, de Ciencia, Tecnología y Medio Ambiente, el Instituto Nacional de Recursos Hidráulicos y el Instituto de Planificación Física. En el mapa de Cuba se observa en verde las áreas marinas protegidas. Las zonas que están acotadas corresponden a las áreas de pesca, de preferencia para la pesca recreativa. En esta se observa de color rojo las zonas que no coinciden con áreas protegidas. El resto de las áreas marinas constituyen las zonas de preferencia para la pesca comercial estatal. Otra regulación para la pesca recreativa lo constituye la captura máxima permisible o cuotas de captura. En esta se establece la captura de un máximo de 15 kilogramos por cada salida al mar en las aguas marítimas de las zonas de gran interés económico pesquero o por cada día de pesca en los cuerpos de agua dulce. Se permite la captura de hasta 30 kilogramos por cada salida al mar en las aguas marítimas de menor interés económico pesquero. La captura de 3 ejemplares por pescador de aquellas especies de gran tamaño cuyo peso unitario sea superior a los 15 kilogramos. Para las especies migratorias no existe ninguna limitación de cantidad o peso. Sin embargo, solo se podrán capturar haciendo uso de un solo palangre criollo, cuyo número máximo de anzuelos será de 3. Queda prohibido capturar, extraer, desembarcar, transportar, procesar y comercializar especies hidrobiológicas en régimen especial de protección, amenazadas o en peligro de extinción. Esto solo quedará permitido de manera excepcional con fines de investigación. También queda prohibido para la pesca recreativa capturar, extraer, desembarcar, transportar, procesar o comercializar sin la correspondiente autorización del Ministerio de la Industria Alimentaria especies destinadas exclusivamente a la pesca comercial. También se consideran violaciones del régimen de pesca una serie de acciones que se muestran en la diapo que atentan contra la conservación, salud y cuidado del medio ambiente. En la prevención y enfrentamiento de las ilegalidades actúan los inspectores de la Oficina Nacional de Inspección Estatal del MINAL, las tropas guardafronteras y otros órganos del Ministerio del Interior. Estos están facultados para aplicar multas, las cuales se suman según la cantidad de violaciones. Se cobra el doble si incurre en más de una ocasión dentro del mismo año. También se pueden efectuar decomisos de artes, avíos, embarcaciones, etc. Y se realiza la negativa a la solicitud de la licencia por 5 años a aquellos pescadores que hayan incurrido en alguna violación de lo establecido. La Comisión Consultiva de Pesca, presidida por el Ministro de la Industria Alimentaria, es el órgano encargado de proponer, previa evaluación, las medidas para el ordenamiento y administración de los recursos hidrobiológicos de las aguas marítimas, fluviales y lacustres, para lograr un uso sostenible que incluya zonas y cuotas de pesca, vedas, establecimiento de tallas o pesos mínimos y máximos, requisitos, limitaciones o prohibiciones de las artes de pesca y otras disposiciones al efecto. Esta comisión se integra por los organismos de la Administración Central del Estado y otras entidades que acuerda el Consejo de Ministros. La Comisión Consultiva de Pesca se organiza y funciona conforme a lo establecido en el reglamento de la ley y de acuerdo a las disposiciones legales complementarias aprobadas por el Ministro de la Industria Alimentaria. Se auxilia para el ejercicio de sus funciones en grupos especializados. Esto es todo. Muchas gracias por su atención.
Muy bien, muchas gracias por esta presentación de Araceli Hernández. A continuación, seguiremos con la presentación ¿Puede la pesca recreativa apoyar a las áreas protegidas y a las economías costeras? Un estudio de caso cubano. Esta presentación estará a cargo de Fabián Pina y Tamara Figueredo. Ambos son consultores ambientales con operaciones de Avalon Diving en Cuba y son profesores del Centro de Investigación Marina de la Universidad de La Habana. Fabián es profesor de zonas protegidas, obtuvo una licenciatura en Biología en la Universidad de La Habana, una maestría en Asuntos Marinos en la Universidad de Dalhousie en Canadá y su doctorado en Ciencias Biológicas en la Universidad de La Habana. Ha recibido numerosos premios, incluyendo una beca Pew en Conservación Marina en 2012 y 6 premios de la Academia Cubana de Ciencias en 2004, 2008, 2009 y 2014. Tamara es profesora de Economía y Medio Ambiente, con una licenciatura en Economía en la Universidad de Camagüey y una maestría en Gestión Integrada de Zonas Costeras por la Universidad de La Habana. Tamara obtuvo un premio de la Academia Cubana de Ciencias en 2014 y fue becaria de la 12ª Conferencia Internacional Bioecon en 2010. Ambos han participado en la declaración de reservas marinas y áreas protegidas en toda Cuba y han contribuido en incontables proyectos científicos en la emblemática área marina protegida de Cuba, el Parque Nacional Jardines de la Reina. Damos comienzo ahora con su presentación.
buenas. En el marco de la reunión anual del Gulf and Caribbean Fisheries Institute, queremos poner a su consideración una presentación sobre los efectos de la pesca recreativa para las áreas protegidas y las comunidades costeras como un caso de estudio en Cuba. Jardines de la Reina es un archipiélago ubicado en la zona suroriental de Cuba que desde el año 1996 fue declarada como reserva marina, mostrada en la línea roja. Posteriormente, en 2010, el área fue declarada un parque nacional que está enmarcada en todo el polígono donde predomina el verde. Es un lugar donde se desarrollan actividades de pesca de langosta y de turismo, fundamentalmente actividades de buceo contemplativo en la porción sur del archipiélago y pesca recreativa en todas las aguas someras que cubren el archipiélago en toda su amplitud. Las actividades turísticas en Jardines de la Reina, establecidas desde finales del siglo pasado, se han considerado importantes y muy destacadas a nivel mundial. Está entre los 50 mejores sitios tanto para el buceo como para la pesca deportiva. Ahora bien, ¿cuáles son los efectos de la conservación de Jardines de la Reina en los peces? Bueno, tenemos dos ejemplos de peces de interés para la pesca deportiva y otros ejemplos para otros peces. En el caso del sábalo, el Megalops atlántico, observamos que a través del tiempo la captura se ha mantenido estable alrededor de los 2 individuos por embarcación por día. Esta es la pesca deportiva de captura y liberación, que es la única que se lleva por parte de la actividad turística. En el caso del bonefish, el macabí, como lo llamamos en Cuba, albura vulpes u otras especies, los números se han mantenido estables en más de 10 años alrededor de los 5 ejemplares. Estas son las especies objeto fundamentalmente de pesca recreativa. Ahora, ¿qué sucede con otras especies? Bueno, aquí mostramos la comparación de Jardines de la Reina en la barra que tiene JR con respecto a otras áreas protegidas, y recalcamos que son todas áreas protegidas declaradas legalmente al sur de Cuba. Observen que tanto la densidad como la biomasa en los hábitats arrecifales, tanto de beriles como de crestas, son mayores en Jardines de la Reina, con un promedio de hasta 2.5 veces superior. Pero esta cifra es aún más grande cuando se comparan los tiburones, que son casi 20 veces más abundantes dentro de la protección que fuera de esta. Pero sí, teniendo en cuenta que hay actividad turística tanto de buceo como de pesca recreativa, que aunque son de bajo impacto siempre causan alguna afectación, ¿a qué se deben estos resultados de la conservación de la ictiofauna de Jardines de la Reina?
Los autores consideramos que esto se debe fundamentalmente a la protección de Jardines de la Reina, al patrullaje efectivo que se ha venido desarrollando por diferentes instituciones por años ya en la zona. Especialmente debemos mencionar el patrullaje cooperado entre los inspectores de pesca y la operación turística, que son las que dedican mayor número de horas a esta actividad, aportando la actividad turística un guía, una embarcación, combustible, alojamiento, alimentación para poder desarrollarla, generando más de 600 horas y en 109 días al año. Adicionalmente, la presencia de los visitantes en la zona y de toda la operación también aportan cantidad de horas de navegación dentro del área del parque. Tanto las embarcaciones de vida a bordo de la operación, donde se hace vida, donde se pernocta, las lanchas de buceo, las lanchas de pesca recreativa moviéndose, son estos visitantes los que realmente se convierten en facto park rangers del área. Debemos destacar que precisamente los pescadores recreativos, que solo representan alrededor de un 40% de los visitantes, son los que realmente recorren todo el parque. Recuerden que la actividad de buceo se comentó que se desarrolla fundamentalmente en la zona sur central del archipiélago. Sin embargo, la pesca recreativa se realiza en todo el sur y en todo el norte del área, logrando que realmente haya presencia de los mismos en casi todo Jardines de la Reina. Solamente la presencia de estas embarcaciones con los visitantes es suficiente para mantener a los pescadores ilegales o cazadores ilegales alejados de las zonas del parque. Ahora, ¿cuál es la repercusión social y beneficios económicos que la pesca recreativa y el turismo en general han traído para la economía nacional y las economías locales? Bueno, fundamentalmente beneficios económicos directos, tanto para las localidades, las comunidades locales, como para la economía cubana en general. La actividad turística genera grandes ingresos. En la barra verde están representados los ingresos directos de la operación turística cubana. La barra gris representan los ingresos de otras empresas del país por la estancia de los visitantes de Jardines de la Reina en Cuba, y la barra azul representa la combinación de ambos ingresos. Podemos ver que hay una tendencia positiva de incremento durante el periodo representado, llegando en el último año alrededor de 3 millones para la empresa turística y hasta 5 millones para el país de forma general. Debemos resaltar que aunque el 40% de estos turistas que visitan el área son pescadores recreativos, estos generan más del 50% de los ingresos. Por lo tanto, es muy importante la actividad, aunque tenga menos visitantes. También debemos resaltar que un beneficio muy importante que genera la actividad turística de jardines es la creación de empleo, sobre todo para las comunidades locales. Más del 52% de los trabajadores que laboran en Jardines de la Reina, tanto para la pesca recreativa como para el buceo contemplativo, pertenecen a la comunidad de Júcaro, que es una de las comunidades pesqueras más pequeñas que tenemos cercanas al Parque Nacional Jardines de la Reina. El número de trabajadores durante el año es variable. En la temporada alta, que se enmarca entre febrero y junio, llegan a ser hasta 170 trabajadores en el área, con un pico de abril a junio que se corresponde con la corrida del sábado. En esta temporada, alrededor de del 70% de los trabajadores empleados corresponden precisamente a la actividad de pesca recreativa. Tengamos en cuenta que hay una proporción de aproximadamente 6 buceadores por un instructor de buceo, mientras que los pescadores son solo 2 por cada guía de pesca, lo que hace que esta actividad genere más empleo, aunque se desarrolla en menor periodo del año. Resumiendo, de forma general, en la presentación se ha podido constatar que el turismo, y en especial la pesca recreativa, es positiva tanto para las comunidades costeras aledañas al área como a las áreas protegidas. Es una recomendación de los autores de este trabajo que este modelo, el modelo de Jardines de la Reina, sea expandido, introducido en otras áreas del país. Ya contamos, por ejemplo, en áreas como Ciénaga de Zapata, Cayo Largo del Sur, Isla de la Juventud y Cayo Cruz, con actividades de pesca recreativa implementándose de forma similar a como se está desarrollando en Jardines de la Reina. Quisiéramos agradecer, pero antes de terminar nos gustaría dar las gracias tanto a GCFI como a EDF por permitirnos estar aquí con ustedes y compartir esta experiencia de Jardines de la Reina.
De nuevo, muchas gracias por la presentación de Fabián y Tamara. Y el tercer representante de Cuba, tenemos ahora a Laura López con la presentación Caracterización socioeconómica de las pesquerías recreativas en Cuba. Laura es investigadora del Centro de Investigaciones Marinas de la Universidad de La Habana, dentro del Grupo de Manejo y Conservación de Recursos Marinos. Laura tiene una licenciatura en Ciencias Económicas de la Universidad de La Habana, con una especialización en evaluación de proyectos de inversión. Sus estudios de posgrado posteriores han estado enfocados en las ramas de la valoración de bienes y servicios ecosistémicos, ecología marina y pesquerías. Sus temas de investigación incluyen la valoración económica de bienes y servicios ecosistémicos, la pesca deportiva recreativa, alternativas de desarrollo económico y ecológicamente sustentables para las comunidades costeras. Comenzamos ahora con la presentación de Laura.
Muy buenos días. A continuación, les presentaré los resultados obtenidos hasta la fecha de nuestra caracterización socioeconómica de la pesca recreativa. en Cuba. Las pesquerías en Cuba han estado centradas en la pesca comercial fundamentalmente estatal y más específicamente en aquellas especies que constituyen rubros exportables para el país o de marcado interés ecológico. Por su parte, los estudios sobre la pesca deportiva, artesanal o de subsistencia en comunidades costeras, volúmenes de captura, especies de objetivo de estas modalidades, impactos sobre las poblaciones de peces y en los ecosistemas en general, debido a la explotación humana y a los cambios ambientales que han tenido lugar con el paso del tiempo, la calidad de vida de los pobladores, entre otros, son escasos. Cabría destacar experiencias en el marco de proyectos nacionales e internacionales como Sabana Camagüey, Archipiélagos del Sur y SOC Pesca como primeras aproximaciones a estos temas. La falta de información referida anteriormente motivó la realización de este trabajo, el cual se ha realizado a partir de una combinación de fuentes históricas, información estadística, recorrido por bases de pesca deportiva en toda la isla, entrevistas, talleres participativos y conversaciones informales tanto con pescadores como con otros actores vinculados con esta modalidad de pesca. Para alcanzar el objetivo general de caracterizar la actividad de pesca recreativa en Cuba con énfasis en el impacto socioeconómico de esta modalidad, nos propusimos como objetivos específicos colectar información socioeconómica acerca de las pesquerías y los pescadores, establecer con los pescadores deportivos y dirigentes de la actividad de la pesca en el país, identificar personas claves dispuestas a colaborar con nuestra investigación, caracterizar bases de pesca deportiva seleccionadas, evaluar el contexto ambiental, social y económico de las comunidades costeras, objeto de investigación, y explorar la incidencia en las capturas de especies de importancia para la captura y liberación como el sábalo y el macabí. Se realizaron 3 viajes exploratorios alrededor del país en mayo de 2016 y 2017 en los meses de abril y agosto, donde se visitaron 40 bases de pesca deportiva y fueron entrevistados más de 180 pescadores. Se realizaron 2 talleres participativos con pescadores de Playa Victoria y se realizaron encuestas a pescadores de Villa Clara, con el objetivo de conocer cómo funcionaba esta modalidad en esos lugares. Al momento de comenzar nuestro trabajo, la pesca deportiva y recreativa no estaba delimitada como lo está hoy con la aprobación de la nueva ley de pesca, de forma que la pesca la dividíamos en 2 grupos, la pesca realizada por los pescadores locales y la actividad turística dirigida al turismo internacional. Los datos oficiales de la cantidad de bases de pescas y embarcaciones y pescadores se reflejan en la existencia de más de 17.000 pescadores y 5.000 embarcaciones para la pesca deportiva, recreativa y más de 18.000 pescadores y 3.000 embarcaciones para la pesca comercial privada. El mapa muestra un total de las 196 bases a lo largo del país. En el caso de las 40 bases de pesca visitadas, aparecen los datos del total de embarcaciones y de ellas cuáles realizan la pesca comercial no estatal, y también se pueden observar las zonas de pesca recreativa de la operación turística con las modalidades de fly fishing, trolling y spinning. A partir de la nueva ley de pesca de 2019, se delimitan las modalidades de pesca recreativa, deportiva y comercial no estatal, cuestión que resulta necesario aclarar para una mejor comprensión de nuestro trabajo a partir de ahora, en el cual no me voy a detener, pues fue explicado con anterioridad por mi colega Araceli Hernández. Solo resaltar que nuestro estudio se enfoca solo en los pescadores locales, los cuales practican la modalidad de pesca recreativa y de pesca comercial no estatal. En esta gráfica podemos observar el número de bases de pesca distribuidas a lo largo del país representadas por las barras azules. En rojo señalo el número de embarcaciones en provincias seleccionadas por ser las que tienen más embarcaciones registradas, y en verde los valores de captura en kilogramos de la pesca comercial no estatal para un año. También para algunas provincias seleccionadas, de forma que podamos ver que los datos no se pueden analizar por separado para medir el impacto de la pesca en un territorio. En sitios con gran cantidad de bases como Holguín, por ejemplo, con 46 bases de pesca, el número de embarcaciones no es significativo, ni los niveles de captura. Sin embargo, como podemos observar en la provincia de Santi Espíritus, con apenas 5 bases de pesca, es una de las provincias con mayor cantidad de embarcaciones, 535 embarcaciones, y capturan alrededor de 350.000 kilogramos de pez al año. Las artes de pesca autorizadas para los pescadores recreativos son el carrete, la vara, el cordel y el anzuelo, mientras que para la pesca comercial se permite el uso de artes de pesca masiva como las redes de enmalle, nazas, palangras y líneas de mano. Los límites de captura para cada modalidad, como fueron explicados anteriormente, para la pesca recreativa se limitan a 15 o 30 kilogramos por jornada en dependencia de la zona de pesca, mientras que las cuotas de captura para las embarcaciones de la pesca comercial no estatal se establecen mediante el contrato, teniendo en cuenta el tipo y tamaño de embarcación, lo que con promedio se encuentran entre 50 y 100 kilogramos al mes por embarcación. Aunque estos datos nos dan una idea del sector, no logran recoger la realidad de todo, pues los pescadores comerciales no estatales pueden realizar también la pesca recreativa. Además, se reconoce la existencia de un número no despreciable de pescadores que realizan la pesca de subsistencia e ilegal. La diferencia entre ambas modalidades está en las artes de pesca permitidas, los tiempos de despacho, el límite de la captura y la posibilidad de comercialización. Solo tenemos acceso a los estimados de captura de los pescadores comerciales no estatales por los registros de capturas de las empresas. Se desconocen los niveles de captura de la pesca recreativa, si realmente pescan solo lo establecido por la ley o no, ya que no existe ningún tipo de control para esta modalidad, solo inspección aleatoria. La pesca submarina y la ilegal tampoco la conocemos. Ahora, en el caso de la pesca submarina, que forma parte de la pesca recreativa, según la nueva ley, por lo que es muy complejo medir la presión de pesca en un área determinada para emitir las medidas de manejo oportunas sobre una especie en particular o sobre una modalidad de pesca. El nuevo marco legal reconoce la importancia de la investigación científica, cuestión muy importante, pues es la primera vez que aparece en nuestro sistema legal. Separa las características de las categorías de pesca deportiva y recreativa e incluye la pesca submarina en esta última. Reconoce la pesca como actividad por cuenta propia con los consiguientes beneficios de la seguridad social. Trata o intenta frenar la pesca ilegal con los mecanismos de inspección y control y recuperar las poblaciones de pesca y proteger las pesquerías de pequeña escala. Las implicaciones para los pescadores locales desde su punto de vista constituyen que se disminuyen las zonas de pesca, disminuyen las licencias de pesca comercial privada y solo se benefician de la seguridad social los pescadores con contrato, por lo que siguen existiendo un gran número de pescadores cuya fuente principal de ingreso es la pesca y tienen tendencia a incurrir en ilegalidades. Los resultados preliminares muestran que las características de las bases de pesca difieren así como las regulaciones a las que están sujetas. De manera general, las embarcaciones tienen muchos años de explotación, están deterioradas, son pequeñas, no cuentan con la infraestructura apropiada para la navegación, las comunicaciones y de refrigeración para conservar las capturas. Los registros de captura son deficientes, primeramente, pues solo se tienen los de la pesca comercial no estatal y además estos no siempre entregan toda la captura, entregan las especies de menor calidad para cumplir la entrega por peso que tienen establecida y las especies de mejor calidad las venden en el mercado informal a mayores precios del que paga la empresa. Los precios de compra de las capturas y los planes de entregas difieren por provincia, pues cada empresa es la encargada de establecerlo. Los pescadores renuevan los contratos aunque la empresa no cumpla por su parte, pues es la única manera de tener más tiempo de despacho y poder utilizar artes de pesca masiva. Para la estimación de capturas totales y el peso en la economía de este sector será necesario analizar cada provincia y o localidad de manera independiente. La realización, por lo tanto, es importante la realización de estudios teniendo en cuenta un enfoque multidisciplinario para poder contribuir a comprender mejor los procesos que están teniendo lugar y a la elaboración de mejores instrumentos de manejo que se adapten a las condiciones específicas de cada comunidad. Los pasos que tenemos por delante son continuar con nuestro recorrido por las restantes bases de pesca del país, evaluar la factibilidad socioeconómica de crear clubes de pesca recreativa en localidades seleccionadas, contribuir con la educación de los pescadores acerca del valor de la conservación y la pesca sostenible, así como para la generación de alternativas económicas sustentables para las comunidades costeras. Y por último, estimar el valor económico de la pesquería recreativa en Cuba, así como su peso en la economía nacional. Antes de concluir, quisiéramos agradecer a Bonfi, Chantal Pontrus, a EDF y GCFI por darnos la oportunidad y un gran apoyo para presentar nuestros resultados en este evento, y a los pescadores sin los cuales este trabajo no sería posible. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Laura. Lalo, I think you are still sharing screen. There we go. Wonderful. All right. Well, thanks so much to the Cuban presenters. That was really interesting. I've heard a lot about that work in discussions with Lalo here at work, but not in quite so much detail. So that was really neat to hear, especially to hear what's currently underway as far as recreational fisheries management in Cuba. One kind of interesting fact for those folks that might just be joining in here in the US, but also in Cuba, in Belize, in the Bahamas, there has been national legislation working on recreational fisheries that's passed at some point in the last 4 or 5 years. So there are a lot of countries that are working on these issues. They're not simple issues, they're very complex. And so there is, just as Dr. Warren Potts mentioned, it's critical to have engagement from all stakeholders and collaboration so that these can be managed for future generations as well. For folks that might just be joining in, I want to remind you that there is a translate function in the bottom right of your Zoom control. It looks like a little globe, and you can select your native language and follow along the entire conference on that channel. Also want to encourage people to use the Q&A function here to ask questions, and we will pull from those for our live Q&A tomorrow. Now I'd like to introduce our presenters from the Bahamas. First, we'll hear from Dr. Krista Sherman. I saw Krista on here just a little bit earlier. She's a marine scientist with more than a decade of research and conservation experience. She earned a PhD in biological sciences from the University of Exeter. She got her master's in ocean science from University of Southampton and a Bachelor of Science in marine science from Jacksonville University. Her PhD research assessed the status, population structure, and dynamics of Nassau grouper spawning aggregations in the Bahamas to better support their conservation. Dr. Sherman is currently the senior scientist for the Perry Institute for Marine Scientists in the Bahamas, with responsibility for fisheries research and the conservation program. So here is Krista's presentation on improving fisheries management in the Bahamas. Take it away, Lalo. Sorry, it looks like Lalo may be having some technical difficulties. Let me share from my screen.
Sep, I think now that if you don't, do you mind, I don't know why, but I cannot share it from my screen. Do you mind doing it from your computer?
Yeah, no problem.
Thanks. Sorry about that.
That's all right. Let me get it fired up here.
And today I'll be talking about improving fisheries management in the Bahamas. Fisheries are inherently vital to small island developing states and coastal nations like the Bahamas. Fisheries provide economic and food security in addition to maintaining biodiversity and other ecosystem services and societal benefits. In the Bahamas, fishing occurs throughout the archipelago, but is concentrated around the banks. However, despite all the benefits they provide, fisheries here in the Bahamas and around the world are threatened by overfishing, illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, habitat loss, climate change, and natural disturbances. Commercial and aquaculture, subsistence or artisanal, recreational or sports fishing are the main fisheries sectors. Tourists that are engaged in recreational fishing spend approximately $527 million a year on accommodation, fishing, and other leisure activities. Recreational fishing provides more than 18,000 jobs, and the commercial fisheries sector employs approximately 9,300 people with an estimated export value of more than $90 million a year. So as you can see, fisheries are extremely important to the economy of the Bahamas. Management of fisheries is legally the responsibility of the Ministry of Agriculture and Marine Resources through the Department of Marine Resources. And the goal of fisheries regulations are to conserve and manage fishery resources found within the country's exclusive economic zone. A copy of the Fisheries Act along with those fisheries regulations can be found online, and the Department of Marine Resources has information on permitting, licensing, etc. on its website. We also recently conducted a review of fisheries in the Bahamas with recommendations for moving that work forward in the future. In terms of recreational fishing regulations, foreign vessels have to apply for a fishing license. There are maximum catches per vessel at any time that are outlined below. There are also restrictions on gear use. So you have to use hook and line unless you obtain a permit for spear fishing, and only 6 rods or reels can be used at any one given time. Selling any products that are caught during recreational fishing is prohibited, and billfish cannot be have to be returned to the sea unless you have a specific license under the terms of your fishing tournament. For commercial fishing, it is illegal for non-Bahamians to fish for fishery resources for commercial purposes within the country's EEZ, even if you're on a registered Bahamian vessel. So there are a number of regulations pertaining to commercial fisheries and some that are pertinent across all fisheries. We have closed seasons for a few species, Nassau grouper, spiny lobster, and stone crab. Size limits for a few species as well. There is a ban on harvesting sharks, turtles, and marine mammals. There are gear restrictions that are outlined in the Fisheries Act, but across all fisheries sectors, long lining, fishing on scuba, the use of spare guns and nets, specifically for bonefish, are prohibited. And there are also restrictions on where spear fishing can occur around New Providence, Grand Bahama, and the Family Islands as well. And obviously, the use of noxious substances and explosives are also prohibited. There are both fisheries-dependent and independent methods used to study fisheries, and from a research perspective, we embarked on a collaborative project using a suite of methods to address key gaps related to the status and population dynamics of Nassau grouper, and use this information to help inform recommendations for sustainable management. And we were particularly interested in this species because Nassau grouper are among the top teleos predators of reef habitats and an important food source for larger apex predators. Moreover, their formation of annual fish spawning aggregations, or FSAs, is not only responsible for replenishing grouper stocks, but also for the addition of key nutrients that are important for coral reef health. This species is important across subsistence, commercial, and recreational fisheries sectors here in the Bahamas and throughout the Caribbean. But globally, these populations are in decline by 80% or more, and Nassau grouper is listed as critically endangered by the IUCN. A part of this decline is being driven by FSA fishing, as well as problems with IUU fishing, which are significantly impacting Nassau grouper populations. So some of the key findings stemming from 2 aspects of our work, specifically the telemetry and the genetics, I'll share with you today. So with regards to the telemetry work, we understand and know that grouper are undertaking these group migrations in synchrony with the lunar cycle. In comparison to what's seen in other parts of the native range of the species, these migrations occur over really long distances, sometimes up to 150 miles. And there are also interspecific differences with regards to the timing of spawning migrations related to the full moon, and as well as swimming speeds. Here in the Bahamas, fish are 54 centimeters or bigger before they migrate to spawn. And this work, in addition to understanding patterns related to spawning aggregations and the reproductive behavior of the species, has indicated where candidate spawning sites may be, and has also shown us where formerly active spawning sites have collapsed. With regards to the genetic work, these populations are genetically diverse, although some measures of genetic diversity are low. We are seeing interest-specific population structure or fine-scale population structure, particularly separating Exuma and Long Island from the rest of the Bahamas. And this structure may be driven by differences in gene flow and loci under selection, which is going to be really important for us to do further work in this area. But more importantly, genetic data showed that Nassau grouper have impaired genetic health. So they are experiencing reductions in the number of breeding individuals that are contributing to successive generations, and they're also showing signs of bottlenecks. So clearly there are some management implications then related to this work with regards to amending fisheries regulations, improving our ability to enforce fishery regulations and to better address IUU fishing, and that some of that can be done through existing mechanisms at the regional level. There's clearly a need for additional research and monitoring, as well as to incorporate population dynamics into marine spatial planning for the protected area system. So this work, along with some other aspects of the work that we did that I haven't presented today, led to the development of a conservation management plan of Nassau grouper. And the goal of this plan is to promote population recovery and sustainability of the Nassau grouper fishery. We have clearly outlined biological justifications for the changes proposed, along with recovery criteria in terms of helping these populations recover. The objectives are to increase Nassau grouper density and spawning stock biomass, to improve sustainable harvest regulations, to reduce anthropogenic threats, and to maintain and or improve essential marine habitats needed throughout the life cycle of the species. Now, the approach that we took for Nassau grouper is relevant to other species as well, and it also has relevance across fisheries sectors. And this is especially important since we know that Bahamian fishery resources are being exploited more than what is reflected in reports. So Smith and Zeller reconstructed total catches, so that's reported catches and estimates of unreported catches, and found that they're 2.6 times greater than the landings GMR reports to the FAO for the Bahamas. And of these, recreational fishing accounted for 55% of reconstructed total catches, and 75% were attributable or linked to the demand tourists place on fisheries products. So healthy fisheries are extremely important for the economy of the Bahamas, as well as to maintaining healthy marine ecosystems. There are many synergies across different fisheries sectors with regards to the species that are targeted, the habitats that they utilize and where fishing occurs, the fishing methods that are used, and obviously their socioeconomic and ecological value. And the impacts are variable in terms of different fishery sectors on marine ecosystems. And there are some exceptions across all these categories in terms of the species, for example, that may be targeted. But there are very few differences between fisheries sectors, and these are primarily socioeconomic drivers that are different across sectors, and varying levels of stakeholder engagement and involvement across different fisheries sectors. So moving forward then, there are a number of recommendations for improving the state of fisheries in the Bahamas that have applications for other countries in the region. We urgently need to improve our governance frameworks by implementing standardized, consistent, accurate, and timely reporting across all fisheries sectors. We need to strengthen national, regional, and international management agreements and partnerships to help with improving the capacity to enforce fishery regulations and to reduce IUU fishing to protect important species and fishery resources. And in order to do this, there obviously needs to be a significant investment to increase capacity, both in terms of financial resources and skills for enforcement, research, and monitoring. There's also the opportunity to improve the link between science and management to make that process more efficient and seamless. We need to develop targeted and effective communication and outreach materials for all stakeholders to increase compliance with fishery regulations. And there's also an opportunity to develop and diversify opportunities for fishers and family island communities in terms of sustainable and ecotourism-based livelihoods and opportunities. And where we are data deficient, there is always the option to use precautionary approaches and ecosystem-based management approaches to protect species and their habitats. So the Bahamas has made some really important steps to manage its fisheries. However, improving our understanding of fisheries through the integration of both biological and socioeconomic approaches is going to be critical to effectively manage these fisheries and obtain and achieve desired conservation outcomes. And this would allow for improvements to economic and food security throughout the country. The future of our fisheries then depends on the successful use of adapting science-based measures and policies in a timely manner that would address both current and predicted anthropogenic and natural impacts to species and their habitats. I'd like to thank the organizers for the invitation to contribute to this special session and look forward to future discussions to advance the state of fisheries in the Bahamas and throughout the region.
Thank you, Krista. That was a great presentation. Up next, we will have a presentation from fishing guide Prescott Smith. Prescott has been a fly fishing guide on the flats of the Bahamas for almost 30 years. He grew up with a passion for fishing and conservation, learning from his father and Bahamian fly fishing founder, Crazy Charlie Smith. Much of Prescott's fishing life has been focused on bringing his father's dream to fruition, to create a countrywide learning network focused on training Bahamians as stewards of their natural resources, to teach them fly fishing as a model for conservation and economic empowerment. That ties nicely into Professor Potts's presentation as well. Prescott served on the Bahamas National Trust from 2012 to 2017. Prescott also led efforts with several local NGOs to successfully establish the West Side National Park on Andros, ensuring the protection of one of the largest nursery systems of mangroves, the largest in the Bahamas. So I will turn it over to Lalo to share Prescott's presentation.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Prescott Smith from the Bahamas. I'm a fly fishing guide on the island of Andros, also president of the Bahamas Fly Fishing Industry Association, as well as president of the Bahamas Sports Fishing and Conservation Association. The fly fishing industry in the Bahamas is extremely important, and at the head of that are fly fishing guides who are at the forefront of using the resources in a sustainable way. Guides are key to the overall development of the industry. And so when you look at not just out there with anglers, we're also engaged in subsistence fishing, fish for our food supplies when we're not out there. And so the understandings of how important the resource is and the need to protect it is at the forefront and foremost of all guides. There are presently 400 plus guides throughout the Bahamas. There is a multi-million-dollar industry that provides considerable revenue to the overall economy, and the potential is a multi-billion-dollar industry throughout the Bahamas. A bit about some of the natural resources of our country. We have the largest flats and bonefish population in the world. We have the largest amount of reefs throughout the Caribbean and in the Western world. And we have the largest mangrove nursery system, not only in the Caribbean, but the entire Western world, and the largest amount of blue holes in the world. Here you can see the light color area compared to the deep blue, all of the flats here. Here is a much better view. You can see the shallow waters in Cuba, Mexico, Belize, and of course the Bahamas here. We have 4 types of mangroves: red mangroves, black mangroves, white mangrove, and buttonwood. And of course, the red mangroves is where most of your marine life live, in the arch root system. But they are a great habitat for bird and a number of other things, great protection from storms and so forth. Here is another view of the mangrove habitat. Bahamas, you can see Cuba and South Florida. Mangroves only exist in the United States, in the South Florida area and a little area in Texas. We had a historic legislation passed and became law in the Bahamas on January 9th, 2017. Some of the key things about that legislation is a conservation fund, where 50% of the fishing license fee is designated to go into that fund. Protection of also bonefish, tarp, and permit snook, cobia. They are now all flats protected species. We continue to fight for the implementation of a national wardens program, and we're about to start a national training program at an institute on Andros Island called BAMSI, which is Bahamas Agricultural and Marine Science Institute. Here's a typical view of the flats on Andros here. Vast amount of area. This is about 15 miles in the interior of the island. Some of the threats to the industry: netting of bonefish, destruction of mangrove habitat, destruction of freshwater lands through mining and cutting of canals, and then mining of the flats for calcium carbonate. And here is an example. While it's an old photo, it's to highlight the using the resource in a sustainable way, as opposed to what you see happening here. And here is a typical school of bonefish on a beautiful flats. And this fishery could be destroyed by one hauling. As you can see here, entire fishery is gone. And so the fly fishing guide and the methods used today has brought a whole new awareness to using the resources in a different way. Here's another typical threat. It's the destruction of the freshwater lands and the habitat, because the mixing of the fresh and the salt water, the mangroves, are all important for having a healthy fishery. And this is on the island of Grand Bahama, vast amount of freshwater lands destroyed. There's a proposed mining for the island of Andros, which is very troubling, because Andros, like Grand Bahama, Andros has the largest nursery system, not only in the country, but it has the largest reef in the Bahamas, the largest freshwater supply, more creek systems. And so there is a proposal for 5,000 acres of mining into the freshwater well fields, which is insane for it to even be considered. But this is a situation that concerns not only us in the Bahamas, but this will have a negative impact on many countries in the region, saying that most of the mangrove habitat that exists in the Western world are in the Bahamas. Here's an example of a mining operation in Grand Bahama, mining right on the flats for limestone. I wanted to point out the positive of a model that we are building on. And persons like my father, who was the first Bahamian to build a lodge, he invented a fly that revolutionized the industry as we know it today. But he's not the only one. This is a photo of Charlie Smith, Crazy Charlie Bonefish Fly. Other pioneers like David Pinder, Senior in Grand Bahama, Ansel Sanders, Bonefish Joe Clare, Rupert Leedon, Ralph Moxie, William Brennan, Bonefish Foley, Bonefish Rudy, Percy Dowell, Felix Smith, and there are many others, guides to name. But they were the real pioneers who developed the model that we're building on today. I would like to see our fellow guides in the region, be it Belize, Cuba, develop associations so that we can network together and build on a model to protect the resources that are important and are linked up, all connected in so many ways. And so I look forward to the legislation that was passed being strengthened, because there are other components. Even though it was passed, it was not met with such a smooth transition, and there's more work to be done. The Bahamas Sports Fishing and Conservation Association, the Bahamas Fly Fishing Industry Association are leading grassroots organizations in the effort to bring about a sustainable model to protect the nursery system that is important to us all, the largest flats and mangrove ecosystem in the entire Western world. Again, I look forward to more collaboration among us guides in the region, anglers who enjoy the sport, and those all over the world who are passionate about the environment. Thank you very much.
Thanks for that, Prescott. I had somebody actually message me privately in the chat during that saying, it sounds like we need to have a recreational fisheries conservation association across the region, across the Gulf and Caribbean. It's an incredible idea. Next, I'd like to introduce our third and final presenter from the Bahamas. We have Vanessa Haley Benjamin, who is currently the chief scientist at the Bahamas Sport Fishing Conservation Association, where she oversees the development of ecosystem management policies and programs for the fly fishing industry. She once served as the chief scientist of the Baha Mar Resort. She was CEO of the Save the Bays NGO in the Bahamas, and she also served as the Director of Science and Policy at the Bahamas National Trust. Ms. Haley Benjamin received her Bachelor of Science in Marine Biology from the College of Charleston, her Master's in Biological Science from Florida International University, and is currently a PhD student at the University of Auckland, New Zealand. Her master's research studied the long distance movements of bonefish species, and her doctorate research interests include using cellular agriculture as a technique for the long-term sustainability of mollusca species. I'll turn it over to Lalo to play this presentation on Bonefish Beyond Borders.
My presentation is entitled Bonefish Beyond Borders, a shared resource in the Caribbean. And over the next few slides, I'll share with you some of the bonefish movement data collected in the Bahamas over a 6-year period, as well as a genetic study in the wider Caribbean to further demonstrate the need for a continued collaborative effort in the protection and management of the bonefish fishery. So who am I? My name is Vanessa Haley Benjamin. I am the Chief Scientist at Bahamas Sports Fishing Conservation Association. I'm also both a marine and cellular biologist. I studied the bonefish movement around Andros Island, Bahamas for my master thesis. I have over 20 years of conservation experience in both the Bahamas and the wider Caribbean, and I'm currently a PhD student at the University of Auckland. The recreational fishery is a multi-million-dollar industry. There are few economic evaluations conducted in the Bahamas. In 2010, Tony Fedler valued the industry at $141 million. In 2015, NACOC placed a valuation on the industry at $411 million. Tony Fedler revisited his study, and in 2018, he placed a new valuation on the industry at $168 million. Wherever you span on that spectrum of placing your own valuation on the industry, it is undoubtedly a multi-million-dollar industry in the Bahamas, a multi-million-dollar industry when you look at the Caribbean as a whole. And so I want to just briefly go through some of the data that was collected on Andros Island. And so what I did was I placed receivers along the west side of the island. This side is the shallow bank. This is the shallow habitat. This is where subadults and adults spend most of their time. Then you have the north bight, which is a corridor that gives access to the deeper water on the east side. And receivers were also placed along this side of the island. The study was conducted between October 2008 to August 2009. 25 fish were tagged. They measured between 358 to 548 millimeter fork length. Well, why is that size important? Well, from the scientific data, it suggests that this is the age where the fish is most likely to be mature and hence make these long distance migrations, as guides have observed for years. And there was an 80% detection rate in my array. Now, what were the results? What we found, well, first of all, we detected bonefish for up to 115 days, tracked them for up to 300 kilometers or 186 miles. 7 fish traveled long distances. And when we say that, we mean they traveled from the west side through the north bight to the east side of the island. This is at least 100 kilometers or 62 miles. Fish were detected on the east side in October 2008 to January 2009. What was most fascinating is the offshore movement of these fish from the presumed, from these pre-spawning aggregations to the deeper receivers that were placed between 20 to 65 feet. This movement occurred around full and new moons. So this was the first time that we did a tagging study in the Bahamas to really track this movement. And North Bight was an important corridor. And we had a further study in Grand Bahama in 2014 by Murchie et al. That found the similar findings. Fish tagged on the north side utilized the Grand Lucayan waterway to access the deeper side of the island. As well as there were fish that were tagged on the west and east side of the island that moved to the south side as well to presume spawning locations. And this here is just a picture of what the Grand Lucayan waterway looks like. In 2011, Daniel Chuck et al. At CEI actually confirmed and observed bonefish spawning behavior. That was in 2011, and it was pretty fascinating that bonefish made these movements to deeper water to spawn. And so now I switch it up a bit and I take you to fragmented creeks. I do apologize, going too fast ahead of myself. Fragmented creeks. These were studies conducted by one of my advisors, Dr. Craig Lehman. Now these studies were conducted in Abaco. And he wanted to look at the impacts of fragmented creeks. And many of the creeks in the Bahamas are cut off either through development of roads, mangroves are pulled out and destroyed. And Dr. Lehman went in and he restored some of these creeks, and pretty fascinating to see the before and after pictures. But what he found was that abundance and diversity of the fish increased following the restoration because it provided an access point for these fish to move in and seek safe retreat from the coral reef habitats. And these are indeed important juvenile habitats as well. Switching from that to talk about, okay, what is the connection in the Caribbean? How are bonefish connected in the wider Caribbean to each other? A multi-year bonefish genetic study was conducted. There were over 11,000 samples of bonefish that were analyzed. Part of the bonefish that I tagged in the Andrews study was used as well. The genetics was used to inform this study. This was done by Bonefish Tarpon and Trust in 2014. What they found was that all bonefish sampled were part of a single genetic population, but the distances influenced how closely related they really were. And bonefish populations in the Eastern Caribbean and the Western Caribbean, there are many generations in between, so they're not connected, they're not closely related. But however, when you look at islands like Cuba and the Bahamas, it's found that there was high connectivity between these countries. Belize, Mexico, and Cuba, there was high connectivity. There was also high connectivity between Belize, Mexico, and Florida. And then also Florida and Cuba had high connectivity. What this shows is bonefish populations across the Caribbean is closely connected. And I think that we should continue to work together, and I propose a bonefish conservation framework. And this framework exists both on the local scale and the regional scale, because locally, we have to conduct the necessary activities to safeguard this fishery. And that entails, what are some of these activities? It's research to inform us, what is the status of the population? Identify what are these critical habitats that the bonefish utilizes. We have to actively restore critical habitats, such as the migration corridors that were identified in both the Andrews and Grand Bahama studies in the Bahamas. And then we need the legislative protection and enforcement framework for these countries. On a regional scale, we need to look at research and better understanding the connection. We need to minimize and mitigate against threats. For example, offshore drilling in one country can affect the fishery in another country, especially if we share the same resources. Bonefish are not confined to our borders. In our minds, we are, but bonefish doesn't see it that way. We need more case studies. We need to share lessons learned. And I look forward to the workshop and the panel where we can continue this collaborative effort. We also need legislative protective agreements between countries. BSCA, it's a nonprofit organization based in the Bahamas, formed by guides. Its mandate is to identify the critical needs affecting the marine environment, specifically the fly fishing industry, and conducting the conservation activities and programs to ensure the sustainability in the short and also the long term. And just a few of the studies, London Creek was restored. London Creek is in Andros. One study by Dr. Craig Lehman found that 80% of the creeks on East Andros are fragmented and blocked. And so BSCA has actively worked on restoring these creeks. One of the biggest restoration projects was the restoration of London Creek, where an old road was put in from logging activities back in the 1960s. Further to that, BSCA has been instrumental in creating a national guide training course and also advocating for local policy to protect and safeguard the fishery and its critical habitats. It's been a pleasure sharing this information with you, and I thank you so much for your time. Please do reach out. My email address is below. Our website is below, although it's currently going under construction. But reach out to me if you want to connect, if you want to collaborate, or if you have any questions. Have a wonderful day.
Saludos a todos. Muchísimas gracias a todos los panelistas de Bahamas. Realmente, como vemos, hay una conectividad intrínseca entre todos los países del Caribe. Ahora vamos a continuar con un bloque que está concebido desde un punto de vista regional. Hemos escuchado participaciones de países específicos, pero quisiéramos realmente enfatizar sobre la importancia del concepto que existe de conectividad entre todos los países del Caribe. Entonces, a continuación escucharemos presentaciones de colegas trabajando en Estados Unidos, en Cuba y en México, y comenzaremos con la presentación organizando guías para mejorar la conservación de la pesca en el Golfo de México de Estados Unidos, a cargo del capitán Scott Hickman de los Estados Unidos. El capitán Scott es un guía de pesca, pescador comercial y propietario de Circle H Outfitters and Charters, que se especializa en excursiones de pesca en Texas. El capitán Hickman es miembro fundador de la Charter Fishermen's Association y fue reconocido con el GCFI Gladen Memorial en 2018. Es miembro de los paneles asesores de recopilación de datos de coral, himero y pargo rojo de Title Fish IFQ para el Consejo de Administración Pesquera del Golfo de México. También es el presidente del Consejo Asesor del Santuario Marino Nacional de Flower Garden Banks. A continuación, la presentación del capitán.
Good afternoon from Galveston, Texas. My name is Captain Scott Hickman. I'm a 35-year professional fisherman here, both engaged in the charter fishing side and the commercial snapper side. I'm an IFQ REOFISH shareholder with Red Snapper. I'm going to talk to y'all today about the different sectors we have here in the Gulf of Mexico. Our federally permitted side, which is fishing out in the federal waters out of Texas, out past 9 miles. On the charter boat side, well, we've got 3 different sectors. You have the charter for hire, federally permitted side, that component, the commercial permitted side that can fish for those to sell back for our consumers, and you have the recreational fishing side. Both the charter boat and commercial side are both regulated in a limited access permit program, so that basically means they're not making any more, so we have what we have. Both those sectors have fished accountably for at least the last 5 to 6 years with very strong conservation accountability measures. And then lastly, we have the recreational side, which doesn't have any type of limited access program and is harder to manage, and they seem to have been overfishing their allocations for as long as I can remember, and a little harder to manage and control. The charter boat side, which I've been actively involved and engaged in for so long, had a lot of the same problems as the recreational side. There's 1,300 federally permitted charter boats in the Gulf currently in that limited access program. We used to be in with the recreational side, and we were penalized yearly, and our seasons got shorter, and myself and about 10 other longtime professional captains got engaged and started a group which ended up being the Charter Association, which was a grassroots movement, started with the help of some environmental non-government organizations like mainly Environmental Defense Fund and the Ocean Conservancy helped us along. And we developed the Charter Fishermen Association to work with managers, other fishers, stakeholders, elected officials, and to come up with a program to let our businesses have a sustainable fishery and a good business plan, which basically given us access. We would be guaranteed every year so we could continue to fish. That particular amendment was called the sector separation movement, in which we petitioned the Gulf Council and went through numerous federal lawsuits once we got it passed. And we now have the first of its kind in the world, our own sub-allocation of fish just for our charter boats in the Gulf. So our clients can come down every year and know when they can go fishing and plan their vacations and have that access to those fish. One of the key components of that was to develop an electronic logbook program, which we fought hard as well for 10 years. We got that passed this last year. The rollout is going to be this January. We're starting to do an outreach and education component to that to educate this 1,300 operators and to really fine tune the accountability of our vessels in the Gulf and not overfish our annual catch limits, and hopefully continue to grow the fishery and have more access in the future and do that in a sustainable way. Sector separation, like I'm going to say again, one of the key components of that for the charter for hire industry was this partnership with federal managers, environmental NGOs, and engaging others to show them that there could be a better way. And that was the key to our success. The commercial side that I'm engaged in was very important, that they were kind of led us along the way. They went to an individual fishing quota program, i.e. a catch share program. They had some of the same issues, no accountability, overfishing their allocations every year to where we didn't have a lot of fish, mainly REOFISH in the Gulf. And they got their 10-year fight just as well, got their program passed, consolidated some of the industry, and were able to start fishing accountably as well, have the flexibility under the catch share program to get the markets, restaurants, fish when the high season prices were good, and let them make more money. The crews are making more money. Once again, that was a really great program, and it's working real well in the water. I'm a participant in that, and it's been fabulous. I can't say enough about the catch share programs that we have in this part of the world now. This year, dealing with the COVID crisis, on the charter for hire side, we had a great success, showing people that our boats could be safe. We actually got our fishery was shut down for a month in April. We went to our local leaders and with a safety plan showing that we would require masks on the visitors on our docks, that we would bleach and scrub the boats and use spray bleach to sanitize our vessels between groups every afternoon or every morning when people came down to the boats, and a super stringent hand sanitizer program for the people while on the vessels, assigning fishing rods to the people on the vessels so that we didn't cross-contaminate the fishing rods. And had a lot of success with that this year with COVID, and actually ended up getting our fishery reopened, and people showed up in droves, had the busiest fishing season for our charter boats that we've probably experienced in the last 15 or 20 years. So COVID's actually worked to our advantage, but only because we developed a really good safety protocol program and promoted that to our local officials and got our fishery reopened on the charter boat side. And then on the commercial side, one of the things that really helped was finding new markets, teaming up with some of the small local farmers markets, also teaming up with some of the grocery store distributorships across the state of Texas to sell fresh fish because of the lack of demand in the restaurants with the reduced capacity and or closure of the restaurants in some areas, and found new markets for commercial fish. And that's been highly successful as well. So circling back, once again, the volunteerism, getting involved to make change, both on the commercial, recreational, and charter boat side. As my 35 years in this fishery, I've volunteered a lot. I'm the current chairman of the Flower Garden Banks National Marine Sanctuary Council. I sit on 3 Gulf of Mexico Fishery Management Councils, advisory panels. I sit on the advisory committee for the Texas Sea Grant program here that does a lot of the work on how our inshore fisheries are regulated and outreach is done to our local fishers. I also sit on the Texas Migratory Bird Council as well, and highly involved in some of the other smaller state level fishing organizations too, as well as being one of the founding board members of CFA, the Chartered Fishermen's Association, which is now, as I know it, the largest fishing association representing charter boats in the United States, which there were 10 of us that started that and developed a lot of sea change. So the thing I'm going to stress to any of the folks that are throughout the Caribbean, South America, Central America, that's gotten involved in the Gulf Caribbean Fisheries Institute, is you can make these differences. You can get people engaged to make these changes and to produce pressure on your local government entities to work with you to come through tough times like COVID, tough management decisions, and find that compromise. And I can't stress enough about how we found successes with partnering up with some of these environmental NGOs and using their expertise in finding ways that work to make our businesses successful and leaving more fish in the ocean for the next generation of fishers. And on that note, I'd like to thank everybody and have an awesome day. From Galveston, Texas, Captain Scott Hickman. Calm seas and tight lines.
Una vez más, agradecer a todos nuestros panelistas. Muchas gracias al capitán Scott Hickman por su contribución. Y ahora voy a cederle la palabra a Leopoldo Palomo con la presentación Pesca recreativa en la Bahía de Ascensión con un enfoque de sistemas socioecológicos. Leopoldo es actualmente el coordinador de recursos y desarrollo tecnológico en la Dirección de Acuicultura de la Secretaría de Pesca Sostenible y Acuicultura de Yucatán, en México. Él es licenciado en Biología por la Universidad Autónoma de Yucatán, con una maestría en Administración de Empresas de Acuicultura y un doctorado en Ciencias en la Pesca y Bioeconomía de la Acuicultura. Leopoldo es un entusiasta de las interacciones entre comunidades costeras, servicios ecosistémicos y gobernanza. Actualmente lleva a cabo investigaciones sobre la pesca recreativa y las interacciones de los sistemas socioecológicos de una comunidad costera en el sur de Quintana Roo.
Hola, ¿qué tal a todos? Bienvenidos a esta plática que veremos un estudio de caso respecto a la pesca recreativa en la Bahía de la Ascensión con un enfoque de sistemas socioecológicos. Este fue un estudio que realizamos entre 2016 y 2018 en la Bahía de la Ascensión como parte de mis estudios de doctorado en bioeconomía pesquera en la Universidad Marista. Pues bien, sabemos que la pesca deportiva, recreativa, es una actividad muy importante en muchos países, como lo es en México. Produce una economía de gran impacto. Sin embargo, en la zona de aguas interiores es una actividad también muy importante. Está muy pobremente estudiada en el país, a pesar de la importancia económica que tiene, sobre todo para las personas que viven en comunidades costeras. Los lugares importantes en Quintana Roo son varios. Aquí están sus nombres de las localidades, pero nos vamos a centrar en lo que fue mi área de estudio, la Bahía de la Ascensión. Esta es una bahía de 740 kilómetros cuadrados. La comunidad más próxima es Punta Allen. Punta Allen está retirado aproximadamente 35 o 40 kilómetros de la ciudad de Tulum, en una carretera angosta, un camino de terracería, que va sobre una barra arenera costera, y al final de esta barra arenera es donde se encuentra la comunidad pesquera. Y las actividades económicas que se realizan en Punta Allen por la gente local son tres. La principal de ellas es la pesca de langosta en casitas cubanas. Aquí se han desarrollado derechos de propiedad, se han dividido los campos pesqueros entre los socios de la cooperativa y son un ejemplo de pesca sustentable. La pesca recreativa, encontramos 4 de las principales especies que más buscan los pescadores recreativos. Las autoridades del área natural protegida, así como la gente local, acordaron prohibir la pesca con redes en esta bahía debido al impacto negativo que tenía sobre las especies de interés para la pesca recreativa. Entonces, esta fue una iniciativa que nace de ambas partes. Y la tercera actividad que se realiza es los paseos en botes, una actividad turística sustentable de observación, y se realiza por 4 cooperativas turísticas principalmente. Aquí hablamos de usuarios de recursos múltiples, y esto nos llevó a pensar que no podíamos analizar solamente a los pescadores recreativos sin considerar las demás actividades que ellos estaban realizando. Entonces nos dimos a la tarea de identificar los elementos clave del manejo y la gobernanza que hacían los usuarios con el uso de recursos múltiples. Comprender estas interacciones entre los usuarios, la gobernanza, el sistema de gobierno. Sabemos que un sistema socioecológico está dividido en general en 3 partes: el subsistema natural, el subsistema social y el de gobernanza. Y también nos interesaba ver cómo pueden coexistir estas 3 actividades en el tiempo. Podíamos ver que las actividades de turismo se desarrollan todo el año, con picos en las temporadas vacacionales. La pesca recreativa antes era muy marcado entre marzo a junio, actualmente se realiza todo el año, sigue habiendo estos picos en estos meses. Y la pesca de langosta se maneja por vedas, entonces la temporada de langosta comienza en julio, hay una alta captura de organismos y esta luego va descendiendo con el tiempo hasta febrero, que se cierra la pesca de langosta. También queríamos ver cómo interactúan estas actividades geoespacialmente. Entonces podemos observar o obtuvimos información y análisis respecto a cuáles eran las zonas que se ocupan para la pesca recreativa, que son estas zonas de color gris tenue. Lo que vemos como rectángulos está englobando los campos pesqueros de la pesca de langosta en estas áreas. Aquí es donde ponen sus casitas cubanas. Y hay una zona que se ve más punteada, de muchos puntitos. Esta es la zona de paseos en bote turístico. Sabemos que el subsistema natural es aquel que representa los ecosistemas. El subsistema social está aquí representado por las 3 actividades económicas de la comunidad, y ellas aprovechan los servicios ecosistémicos del sistema natural, ya sea como un valor de uso, captura y liberación de organismos. Hay una interacción en la que ingresan botes y sale la satisfacción del pescador recreativo de haber estado en un lugar con muchas oportunidades de pesca. Las cooperativas turísticas hacen un valor de no uso al ser solamente recreativos, y las cooperativas de langosta realizan un valor de uso al extraer la biomasa de langosta del sistema natural. Ellos están gobernados por un sistema en donde hay políticas regulatorias, donde se busca la conservación. Son varias dependencias e instituciones mexicanas que mueven esto, pero también están las comunidades, las cooperativas de la comunidad, que también tienen injerencia en estas políticas de manejo. Las motivaciones son los incentivos económicos a realizar estas actividades. Los manejadores externos vienen siendo los mercados, el mercado de actividades sustentables, el mercado de mariscos. Este modelo evolucionó y con el cual realizamos un análisis bajo el marco de sistema socioecológico de Ostrom, donde tenemos variables de primer orden y cada una de estas variables tienen interacciones entre ellas y en cada una de ellas hay variables de segundo orden. Se debe de considerar que los usuarios realizan de 2 a 3 actividades, al menos, bueno, 1 a 2 actividades. Es decir, los mismos pescadores de langosta, cuando está la temporada de veda, realizan actividades turísticas, ya sea como guías de turismo o guías de fly fishing, donde se requiere una mejor preparación y habilidad. Aquí tenemos las variables de segundo orden que pudimos identificar en el marco de Ostrom, al centro del sistema natural, cómo interactúan lo referente a la actividad de pesca de langosta. Hay un flujo de bienes y servicios, un flujo del dinero que se genera, el impacto económico local. Esto es para la pesca recreativa y aquí lo observamos para el turismo. Todos tienen un tipo de manejo de gobernanza, el cual desglosamos en esta imagen. Tenemos actores locales y cómo interactúa su gobernanza en diferentes niveles. Asimismo, el ecoturismo formando cooperativas, pero en la pesca recreativa observamos que son guías locales que toman acuerdos entre ellos. No todos toman los mismos acuerdos, no tienen una cooperativa como tal, pero obedecen las reglas impuestas por el gobierno, si bien también han generado un código de conducta entre ellos. Entonces aquí vendría un nivel de complejidad del sistema de gobernanza que se observa. Concluimos este estudio mencionando que la gobernanza local es un determinante del factor de sustentabilidad. Hay un capital social que es lo que le da la fuerza a la comunidad, le da un sentido de apropiación de los recursos y eso permite desarrollar habilidades para realizar estas actividades de conservación. La pesca de langosta es positiva para el manejo sustentable que se hace es positivo para las actividades turísticas, pero los paseos en bote, cuando no cumplen los códigos de distancia, de velocidad de embarcación, tienen algunos roces con los usuarios locales y los clientes de la pesca recreativa al generar áreas de hacinamiento. Como comentarios finales, se debe de considerar la diversificación que tienen la gente local en las comunidades, no solamente verlos como pescadores, como guías de turismo o de pesca recreativa, sino que ellos diversifican estas actividades, no es la única que realizan. Observamos que el efecto multiplicador del turismo es muy importante para el resto de la comunidad. Con ello pueden tener ingresos todo el año. Y el sistema socioecológico, observamos que la gobernanza local es fuerte y eso es lo que permite el manejo sustentable del sistema. Este tema lo desarrollo más en esta publicación que les comparto. Y es todo, agradecer como siempre a los amigos de Punta Allen, a mis compañeros y gente que me ha apoyado, instituciones que me han apoyado para la realización de este estudio. Muchas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias a Leopoldo por su presentación. Como vemos, la gobernanza pues realmente es un tema clave para poder avanzar cualquier objetivo de sostenibilidad en torno al sector recreativo. A continuación vamos a escuchar la presentación La pesca deportiva en Cuba, una oportunidad económica sostenible y basada en la conservación, a cargo de Fernando Bretos y Katie Thompson de Oceans Foundation. Fernando tiene una maestría de la Escuela Rosenshell de Ciencias Marinas y Atmosféricas de la Universidad de Miami y una licenciatura en Biología del Oberlin College. Fernando es un Kinship Conservation Fellow y recientemente se convirtió en National Geographic Society Fellow. Actualmente lidera un esfuerzo multinacional para crear una red de áreas marinas protegidas en el Golfo de México llamado Red Golfo de México. Katie es gerente de programas de la Iniciativa de Investigación y Conservación Marina del Caribe de The Oceans Foundation. Katie tiene una maestría en Asuntos Marinos de la Escuela de Asuntos Marinos y Ambientales de la Universidad de Washington. Sus proyectos actuales se enfocan en la conservación y estudio de recursos marinos compartidos, la restauración de hábitats marinos y costeros, desarrollo de políticas ambientales nacionales y regionales, así como el apoyo a medios de vidas alternativas basados en protección de especies marinas en peligro de extinción. Continuamos con su presentación.
Hi, my name is Katie Thompson, and I'm Program Manager at the Ocean Foundation. And today I'm here to talk to you about our project called Recreational Fishing in Cuba, a sustainable conservation-based and economic opportunity. And I want to thank my co-authors, as well as the organizations that they represent, Hart Research Institute, Cuban Fisheries Research Center, and the University of Havana. I also want to thank GCFI conference organizers and Environmental Defense Fund for inviting us to present during the special session. So today I'm going to talk to you about, give a brief context of rec fishing in Cuba, talk to you about the goal of our project, so what kind of activities we've done within the country, and as well as what lessons we've learned from countries in the Caribbean and around the world. And then I'll wrap up with some short conclusions. Tourism is a very important sector within Cuba. The government has recognized it as a key strategic sector, particularly in terms of ocean-based tourism. Recreational fishing is considered an untapped economic opportunity by stakeholders in Cuba, yet there is limited national statistics on the income generated by the industry, and there's also limited catch data. Our project aims to foster recreational fishing growth in Cuba in a sustainable, conservation-based way that provides an economic opportunity for coastal communities. It's a 3-year project funded by Hart Charitable Foundation, and we at the Ocean Foundation are collaborating with HRI, CEEP, Cuban Fisheries Research Center, and SEAM, University of Havana's Marine Research Center, as well as Hemingway International Yacht Club. And there's really 4 main strategies that our project entails. The first is to study the current Cuban policies at play. So what is the landscape in terms of rec fishing policy in Cuba? Draw from case studies in 2 different Cuban sites. The first site is along the southern coast of Cuba, where recreational fishing has been occurring for decades, and the industry has been very successful there. The second site being on the northern coast of Cuba, where there is not a strong industry, but there is potential for one. The third aspect of our project is to conduct habitat and population studies of target rec fishing species and the habitats that they depend on for survival. And then the fourth aspect is to draw lessons learned from other countries. So in the Caribbean, or even looking globally, what have countries done in terms of sustainable rec fishing policies and programs? How have they built their industry up in a way that is sustainable and conservation based? Within Cuba, here are some of the activities we have conducted so far in this project. The first is this analysis of the national fishing policy in Cuba, including the new fisheries law that was approved last year, studying how rec fishing operates on the ground and what benefits it brings to communities in these 2 pilot sites I mentioned in the previous slide, the first being Ciénaga de Zapata National Park along the southern coast of Cuba, and the second site is Caguanas National Park along the northern coast of Cuba. Last summer, we held a workshop in Havana that brought together rec fishing stakeholders from across the country in Cuba, as well as a representative from Bahamas, a rec fishing guide. And the goal of this workshop was to really understand the context of the industry in Cuba. What has been its history? What are some opportunities for growth, according to the perspectives of the stakeholders? out of this workshop was a very significant outcome, which was the creation of the Cuban National Recreational Fishing Working Group. And the idea of this working group is to inform the industry as it moves forward, as it grows within Cuba, to make sure that the correct research is conducted, the correct stakeholders are involved in this growth, so that it is done in a sustainable way. Here are some of the activities that HRI is conducting at Caguanas National Park. It's a joint project with the University of Havana with a focus on lifestyles and adaptation to environmental change in the local fishing community and the farming communities. They've conducted various workshop and capacity events for the community and park staff. They've done various mapping efforts of the seagrass and other habitats in Caguanas, and have produced various publications on the results of their research. An important part of the project has been the case studies we've conducted on rec fishing policies globally. Most of the countries we've been looking at have been in Caribbean, but we've also drawn examples from countries around the world. We've conducted 10 different case studies on Bahamas, Mexico, Belize, Bermuda, British Virgin Islands, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Palau, Seychelles, and South Africa. And looking at each of those countries, we studied what are the rec fishing regulations, who is the regulating agency, what are the license requirements and fees, what are the tournament format and fees, and what kind of sustainable management practices do they have in place. So are there species restrictions, catch bag limits, area and seasonal closures, reporting, or fees towards marine conservation? So from these case studies, we came up with 3 main recommendations for Cuba as it considers options for how to generate money for marine conservation efforts from the rec fishing tourism industry. And the first, which we thought was most feasible, was the tourism environmental impact fee. So this is a fee that foreign anglers will pay when they join a sport fishing tournament, for example, the annual Ernest Hemingway sport fishing tournament that happens out of Havana. So part of their fee would go directly towards marine conservation and marine science efforts within Cuba. And the second and the third recommendation is a license fee, so either paid by the individual or by vessel. And again, those fees would go directly towards marine science and conservation work within the country. So one of the countries that was a topic of these case studies, which we were fortunate to go and visit, was Seychelles. We had an exchange visit there in September 2019. The Ocean Foundation traveled with representatives from Cuba, from the Fisheries Research Center, and the Center for Protected Areas. And the goal of this exchange was to share marine and coastal resource management strategies, under which our recreational fishing efforts fell. The takeaways from this exchange was that Cuba and Seychelles, while being many, many miles apart, they have a lot of the same challenges and are at the same point in terms of the management of the rec fishing industry. Recently, just like in Cuba, Seychelles passed a new fisheries law, and they're at the same point where they're thinking about how can this industry that's globally popular, many people travel to Seychelles annually to fish recreationally, so how can this industry grow in a sustainable way? Just like Cuba, Seychelles acknowledged that there are opportunities to grow. Cuba was really impressed with the management of the rec fishing data that Seychelles does, and Seychelles really admired the Cuban model of reducing negative impacts of the sport fishing industry within its national parks. And then out of this visit came a very important drafting of the first ever conservation agreement between Cuba and Seychelles. Cuba and Seychelles have decades of very positive history, but this was the first agreement that really focused on conservation, which we're very proud of. So to conclude, it's clear through our project we've learned that there's a wealth of wreck fishing experience globally, but particularly in the Caribbean. So there's great opportunities for countries to increase their knowledge exchange surrounding this topic. There's also great opportunities surrounding the Cuba's new fisheries law. And really, the sustainable wreck fishing industry has an important role to play in the region's post-COVID recovery, particularly in a blue economy approach. So we see a very positive future for the wreck fishing industry in the region, especially if it's done and developed in a sustainable way. Thank you very much for your time, and please feel free to reach out to me if you have any comments or questions.
Thanks to Katie for that presentation. Again, lots of really impressive, incredible things going on across the Caribbean. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker from Belize. Adiel Perez Cobb is a PhD candidate in ecology and sustainable development from Belize. He is studying connectivity produced by bonefish movement between a subtropical estuary and the Caribbean coast of Belize and Mexico. After working for 2 years as a manager for Southwater Key Marine Reserve, he pursued a master's degree in natural resources and rural development with an orientation in management in Mexico. During his master's studies, he developed a technique called mixed methods approach, which is a combination of techniques such as traditional ecological knowledge, grill surveys, interviews, workshops, and ethnographic notes in coastal fishing communities, which is used to characterize the recreational sport fishing of Belize. I texted Adiel about this earlier. I think this is a really neat approach that seems relatively novel, at least across the Caribbean. This similar approach is being used in Belize and Mexico to understand bonefish migration, local movements, pre-spawning sites, and how environmental variables influence these. Adiel was born and raised in a small fishing community of Sarteneja, Belize, and serves as a board member on the Sarteneja Alliance for Conservation and Development in a nonprofit organization that co-manages Corozal Bay Wildlife Sanctuary in Belize. I will now turn it over to Adiel.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Adiel Perez, and I'm the Belize Mexico Program Coordinator. I work for Bonefish and Tarpon Trust, and my background is in interdisciplinary studies in natural and social sciences, with concentration in management and biodiversity conservation. My skills, knowledge, and experience is largely in fisheries development, protected areas, ecology, and fish movement. I will be talking about fisheries and protected areas management, and I will be using the flats fishery as a model. To start with, I would like to give a strong message. First, we need healthy habitats, but also we need sustainable activities. And with these, we will be able to have healthy and sustainable fisheries. There are several needs in management in the country of Belize. There are 3 major fisheries in Belize: the lobster fishery and the conch fishery. Both of these fisheries are managed largely using the resource base, that is, the biology of the species, setting up sizes, seasonality, and other measures. We also have the fin fisheries, and the one that is a concern are the artisanal, subsistence, and commercial fisheries, and also the recreational sport fishes. And in this one, there are two major types. One is the catch and release that takes place inshore, and the other one is the catch and consume, which occurs inshore and also offshore. There are several issues regarding these fisheries. One is that there is unsustainable non-fishing activities occurring. For instance, there is habitat loss and degradation. These are pictures taken up from northern Belize, and as you can see, mangroves are being cut. Mangroves are important as they offer many ecological and services to humans. Unfortunately, there's also a lot of dredging that is destroying our seagrass. So right here, we're seeing that our mangroves and our seagrass are being destroyed. Now, these are some of the things that resource managers need to take into consideration, especially in their management plans and strategies. Now, because of this, there's a loss in structure and function. In other words, we're losing those habitats that offer recruitment of juvenile finfish. So in other words, if we lose these habitats, we're not gonna have a sustainable and healthy fisheries. There's also unsustainable fishing activities, mainly artisanal fisheries. And as you can see, some of the shadows inside of the trap are tarpon. In other words, these fisheries also have incidental capture. In that trap, there were also permit and bonefish. In the recreational fisheries, there's also a lot of poor handling of tarpon and other sport fish, and in some cases, there's an excessive extraction of these sport fish. There's also unsustainable development projects, mainly land are being filled in, properties of people, right? Foreigners or local people wanting to develop their properties. They're mainly doing land reclamation. So because of this, we're also losing a lot of our habitats, those juvenile and recruitment areas, we're losing them. There's also poor management in the area. Inside of the protected areas, for instance, in Holchan Marine Reserve, there are 2 parcels that were surveyed that were inside the protected area. How can this happen? There's also a lot of dredging that end up affecting protected areas. These are all also occurring near the protected areas. So there are issues in management inside and outside protected areas. There's also issues regarding urban and rural development. This is a picture from 2003. In 2020, we can see all of those nursery habitats, those creeks, those backwaters, all being filled up, dredged for development in the northern area of Belize. Now, for these reasons, BTT's 20+ years of science and conservation has concentrated in bonefish, tarpon, and permit because these species inhabit or are associated to mangroves and seagrass. In the entire region, if we look at the large spatial area of international boundaries, there's a lot of connectivity that occurs, mainly by adult migration, larval distribution, and populations. So all of those areas in Florida, the Bahamas, Cuba, Mexico, and Belize, they're all connected biologically and ecologically. However, there's also human activities that end up connecting everyone. Binational, for instance, between Belize and Mexico, there's a lot of activities. And even in the Yucatan Peninsula, there are several states that also have a lot of human activities. In the recreational sport fishing, a lot of the anglers come from Florida, other areas of Canada, and also Europe into the different countries to fish. Now, PDT's approach basically concentrates on looking at local to regional scales. For instance, there's a point source pollution in the northern part of Belize. During the dry season, water accumulates into the river. There's also accumulation of runoff from agriculture and rural and urban activities that also end up washing into the Corozal Chetumal Bay. This, for instance, when the rainy season starts, it washes everything up into the bay. When the cold front season starts, it piles all of that water into the leeward side of Mexico and also Belize. All of those water end up in our beautiful coral reefs. So we need to look at things not only nationally, but also regionally, right? Everything from the rivers, estuaries, and also the marine areas. And with this, I would like to end by saying that there's an important need to address the threats in the recreational sport fishing of Belize, Mexico, and other areas of the region. I would like to end this presentation by thanking everyone for listening, and have a good day.
Muchas gracias por esta última presentación de Adiel de Belice. Quiero agradecer a todos los panelistas por sus interesantes contribuciones para esta sesión. Hemos también recibido excelentes preguntas por parte de los asistentes que, como vimos esta mañana, se están uniendo de todas partes del mundo a través de Zoom y YouTube. Muchas gracias por el interés en esta sesión. Y bueno, durante estas 2 horas hemos escuchado perspectivas de parte de pescadores, de científicos, administradores y diferentes actores del sector recreativo sobre cómo se está manejando el sector, diferentes tipos de gobernanza, protocolos de colecta de datos, estudios de conectividad y propuestas de cómo incorporar más voces para contribuir con la sostenibilidad de este sector. Como ya he mencionado antes, un factor que quisiera resaltar que hemos visto en estas presentaciones es la importancia del trabajo a nivel regional para comprender las complejas interacciones ecológicas y socioeconómicas que forman parte del sector pesquero recreativo. Nos da gusto que GCFI permita esta interacción entre diferentes países a este nivel regional que es muy importante. Esperamos que los temas que aquí hemos abordado permitan fortalecer y crear alianzas para seguir avanzando hacia la sostenibilidad de las diversas actividades ligadas con el sector recreativo. Este trabajo colaborativo y regional será especialmente importante ante los eminentes retos comunes como son el cambio climático y la pandemia del COVID-19. Los invitamos a conectarse una vez más mañana a través de Zoom o del canal de YouTube de GCFI, mañana miércoles 4 de noviembre a las 10 de la mañana, hora del este de Estados Unidos. Continuaremos con una sesión de preguntas y respuestas en vivo con los panelistas que se presentaron el día de hoy. Es entonces que contestaremos a las preguntas que nos hicieron favor de escribir en el chat. Sé que algunas ya se contestaron en vivo hoy, pero mañana tendremos la oportunidad de que los panelistas las respondan también en vivo. Hemos diseñado el panel el día de mañana para ayudarnos a identificar y comprender las necesidades y desafíos actuales de administradores pesqueros y los diversos actores en países de toda la región. No se pierdan esta segunda sesión y en nombre de EDF y GCFI agradecemos mucho su interés en esta sesión. Esperamos verlos mañana y que tengan un excelente día le cedo la palabra ahora a Fadila Ali, que va a también dar unas palabras de despedida. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you to all the panelists today. Thank you especially to our moderators, Sep and Lalo. And it definitely has been a great session filled with lots of interesting and diverse presentations. Thank you also to our interpreters for doing such a fabulous job, for keeping us fully updated. For us non-Spanish speakers and non-English speakers, we've been able to be fully immersed in today's session. So thank you especially to our interpreters as well as to our tech support team for all their hard work today. We really do appreciate this. And yeah, just a final plug, be sure to join us tomorrow. As Lalo said, today was really about setting the foundation for tomorrow's very interesting panel discussion. We've already started to answer some of the questions, and it's really going to be a very interesting session tomorrow. So be sure to join us at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. Thank you, everyone. Nancy Cummins, I see you have a hand raised. Did you have a question? Oh no, I think it was an accident.
Fadila, Lalo, Sep, if they're still there, very good job. Very good section.
Thanks, Alejandro.
I just put a question to Lalo because